He couldn't stand still. Not when every mile his army gained felt like it might be the one that finally cracked the last German defenses wide open, not when the men looking to him still had fight left in them, and not when the thought of another winter grinding the war into stalemate made something inside him burn hotter than any artillery barrage. In the fading light of another long day in Lorraine, George Patton moved through the forward areas like a man who had already decided the next battle would be won before the enemy even knew it had begun. His boots kicked up small sprays of mud with every step, the same mud that had clung to every vehicle, every uniform, every pair of boots for weeks now. He stopped beside a Sherman tank whose crew was still working in the half-dark, their breath rising in thin white clouds as they tightened track pins with numb fingers. One of the men looked up, grease streaking his face, and for a moment their eyes met. Patton didn't smile. He simply nodded once, the kind of nod that said he saw the exhaustion and the pride both, and that he expected the machine, and the men, to be ready when he called on them again. The tanker straightened a little taller before going back to his work. That was how it always went. Patton didn't have to raise his voice to make men want to be better than they thought they could be. Further back, in a battered stone house that served as a temporary command post, a young sergeant from Ohio sat on an ammunition crate and tried to write a letter home. The paper was already damp from the cold that had worked its way through the walls. He had been trying for 20 minutes to find the right words. His wife had written that their little boy was asking when Daddy would come home to see the snow with him. The sergeant wanted to write something hopeful, something that wouldn't lie but wouldn't scare her either. He finally put the pencil down and rubbed his eyes. Outside, the low rumble of distant artillery rolled across the hills like thunder that never quite arrived. It had been like that for days, close enough to remind everyone the war was still very much alive, far enough that a man could almost pretend, for a few minutes, that he was just working late on a stubborn piece of machinery. The sergeant wasn't alone in that feeling. All across the forward positions, men who had fought their way from the beaches through hedgerows, across rivers, and into these rolling fields were doing the same quiet arithmetic in their heads. How many more towns? How many more nights sleeping in wet clothes? How many more friends whose names would be read aloud back home before this thing finally ended? They didn't talk about it much. Instead, they cleaned weapons that didn't need cleaning, checked track tension on tanks that had already been checked twice, and shared whatever small comforts they still had, a cigarette passed from one gloved hand to another, the last square of chocolate broken in half without a word. One private, barely 19, had spent the afternoon helping an older sergeant dig a better drainage ditch around their position because the rain had turned the ground into a sucking mess that threatened to swallow their sleeping bags. When they finished, the older man had simply clapped the kid on the shoulder and said, "You'll do." That was all. It was enough. Patton understood that language better than most. He had seen too many armies lose their edge the moment they stopped moving. He had watched good men grow cautious, and cautious men die. So he kept them moving, even when the supply columns struggled to keep up, even when the roads turned into ribbons of mud that swallowed trucks whole, even when the weather began to turn and the first sharp edge of winter started cutting through the thin jackets that had been enough in October. He visited the hospitals when he could, not because it was required, but because he needed to look the wounded in the eye and let them see that their pain mattered to the man who had sent them into it. He listened to the stories of crews who had lost friends when a round found the weak spot on a tank, and he never let the conversation end on pity. He always found a way to turn it back to what they had accomplished together, what they would still accomplish. The men didn't always love him for it, but they rarely doubted that he cared about getting them home alive more than he cared about anything else, except winning. That restlessness had carried the Third Army farther and faster than most people had believed possible. They had liberated town after town, seen French families come out of cellars with tears in their eyes and bread still warm from ovens they had hidden from the retreating enemy. Those moments stayed with the men. A little girl handing a tired infantryman a flower she had somehow kept alive. An old man pressing a bottle of wine into a tanker's hands and refusing to take it back. Small things, but they added up. They reminded everyone why the mud and the cold and the long nights mattered. This wasn't just ground to be taken. It was people to be freed, a war to be finished so that no more little girls had to hide flowers from soldiers who might steal them. Yet for all the ground gained, there was a quiet frustration that ran through the ranks like a low-grade fever. The supply lines were stretched thin, and everyone knew it. Fuel that should have been flowing forward sometimes arrived late or not at all. Ammunition had to be rationed in ways that made gunners grit their teeth. Replacements came in green and had to learn the hard way that the enemy still knew how to fight when he chose the ground. Patton hated every hour his army wasn't advancing. He would stand over maps with his staff late into the night, pointing at objectives farther east, already planning the next bound even while the current one was still being secured. His voice would get that edge it took on when he was pushing, sharp, certain, almost impatient with anything that sounded like a reason to slow down. But then he would step outside, light a cigarette, and look at the same stars the men in the foxholes were looking at, and for a moment the restlessness would soften into something closer to worry. He knew what another winter could do. He had seen it before. He did not want his men to pay that price if there was any way to avoid it. One evening, after a long day of visiting forward positions, Patton stopped beside a small fire where a handful of infantrymen were trying to warm their hands. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood there for a minute, listening to them talk about home the way men do when they think no one important is around, about the smell of fresh-cut hay, about wives who wrote every week, about kids who were growing up without them. When one of the men finally noticed him and started to rise, Patton waved him back down. He asked a quiet question about the new replacements in their squad, listened to the answer, then said something simple about taking care of each other out there because nobody else could do it for them. Then he moved on. The men didn't cheer or make a fuss. They just went back to their fire a little straighter. That was the effect he had. He made them remember why they were still willing to do the hard things. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. The fields that had been green and alive with harvest not long ago were turning brown and hard. The roads that had carried the army forward were now fighting back, rutted and slick. Men woke with frost on their blankets and wondered how much colder it was going to get before this was over. Yet the restlessness never left. It showed in the way crews kept their tanks ready to roll at a moment's notice, and the way patrols went out even when nothing much was reported, and the way letters home still ended with some version of "see you soon" even when the writer wasn't sure anymore what soon looked like. They had come too far to believe the war would simply stop because the weather turned or the supplies ran thin. They had learned, the hard way, that momentum was something you either kept or lost forever. And so they waited, and they worked, and they held on to the small things that made the big thing bearable. A joke passed between two men who had seen too much together. A letter folded carefully and tucked away until the next mail call. A quiet promise to a new kid that he'd be all right if he stuck with the squad. These were the things that kept the blade sharp even when the edge should have dulled. These were the things Patton saw when he looked at his army, not just machines and maps and objectives, but men who had already given more than anyone had a right to ask and were still willing to give more if that was what it took to finish the job and go home. That same fighting spirit, the one that refused to let mud or cold or exhaustion have the final word, is the spirit we still honor today in the stories we tell and the things we keep close. If you want to bring a piece of that history into your own home, or experience another powerful story of courage and sacrifice from the war, there are ways to do it that feel right. You might look for authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a small part of what those men carried, or you might want to watch the movie Midway on Prime, which captures the same kind of relentless drive and quiet heroism in another theater of the same great struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, what made Patton's army different wasn't just the orders he gave or the ground they took. It was the simple, stubborn fact that the men who followed him had decided, long before any of them realized how hard the test would become, that they were not going to be the generation that let the job go unfinished. They were tired. They were cold. They missed home more than they would ever say out loud. But they were still moving. Still ready. Still carrying that restless blade forward, one muddy mile at a time, because stopping was never an option they were willing to consider. And somewhere beyond the hills they faced each morning, the war was waiting to see just how far that blade could cut when it was finally swung in earnest. The snow came early that year to the Ardennes, settling over the tall pines and narrow roads in a quiet that felt almost gentle to the American soldiers who had been sent there to rest. They welcomed the lull. After months of hard fighting further south and east, where other units had clawed forward through mud and hedgerows and ruined towns, this stretch of front seemed like a gift. The patrols went out and came back reporting nothing unusual. The artillery stayed mostly silent. Men found time to write letters home without the constant fear that the next shell might interrupt the sentence. One sergeant, a quiet man from the Midwest who had already seen too much, sat in a dugout one evening and told his squad that maybe the Germans really were finished after all. The words hung in the cold air for a moment before someone changed the subject to what they would do when they finally got home. No one wanted to argue with the hope. That same forest, only a few miles away in places the Americans could not see, was filling with men who moved only at night and spoke only in whispers. German soldiers arrived in small groups, their vehicles hidden under branches and netting the moment they stopped. They had been ordered to leave no trace, no smoke from fires, no lights after dark, no sound that might carry on the wind. A young private from a village near the Rhine crouched in the back of a truck one night, his hands numb from gripping the cold metal, and wondered how long a man could go without really sleeping. He had not written to his mother in weeks because there was no way to send the letter without breaking the secrecy. Instead, he carried a small photograph of her in his pocket and touched it sometimes when the fear got too close. Around him, other men did the same small, private things. One shared the last of his bread with a comrade whose own rations had been lost in the dark. Another helped a tired driver camouflage his half-track by weaving pine boughs through the netting, working in silence even though their fingers ached. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet ways men kept each other alive when the only thing that mattered was that no one on the other side of the trees ever knew they were there. The Americans in their forward positions felt the cold too, but they met it differently. In the villages and farmhouses they had taken over, they stacked extra blankets, played cards by the light of carefully shaded lamps, and sometimes even managed a hot meal that did not come from a can. A young replacement who had arrived only a week earlier wrote to his girlfriend that the war seemed far away here. He described the snow on the pines and the way the forest smelled clean after a fresh fall. He did not mention the way some of the older men still jumped at sudden sounds or how the veterans never quite relaxed even when the sector was supposed to be quiet. Those men had learned that quiet could be a trick the enemy played. But even they wanted to believe this time might be different. After years of war, the body and the mind both craved a stretch of days where the only enemy was the weather. What none of them could see was how carefully the forest on the other side was being turned into a hiding place. German troops worked through the nights, moving artillery pieces by hand when engines might have given them away, digging positions that would stay invisible until the moment they were needed. A lieutenant who had fought in Russia and in Normandy walked among his men one frozen morning before first light and reminded them that the entire plan depended on remaining unseen. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked each soldier in the eye and asked if they understood what failure would cost their families back home. The men nodded. Some of them had already lost brothers or fathers in earlier years of the war. They knew the stakes were not abstract. The lieutenant himself carried a letter from his wife that he had not been able to read fully because there was never enough light or time. He kept it in his breast pocket anyway, close to his heart, and sometimes his hand would drift there when he thought no one was watching. On the American side, the same kind of private hopes and fears played out in daylight. A company commander made his rounds and stopped to talk with a machine gun crew that had been in position for days. The men were tired but not unhappy. One of them had received a letter from home with a photograph of his newborn daughter. He showed it around carefully, protecting it from the damp. The captain looked at the picture for a long moment and then told the gunner that the little girl was counting on him to stay sharp even when nothing seemed to be happening. The words were simple, but they landed. Later that night, the gunner wrote a short note to his wife and tucked the photograph back into its envelope, promising himself he would keep it safe no matter what. He did not know that just beyond the next ridge line, German engineers were finishing the last camouflaged positions that would soon turn this quiet sector into something else entirely. The deception worked because it fed on something deeply human. The Americans had been winning for months. Their army had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, pushed across France. It was natural to believe the enemy was as worn down as they sometimes felt themselves. When patrols reported odd sounds in the distance or tracks that did not quite match what they expected, the reports were often filed away with the quiet assumption that the Germans were probably just moving supplies or rotating tired units. No one wanted to be the man who cried wolf when the real fighting was happening somewhere else. That reluctance was not cowardice. It was the same instinct that makes people look away from signs they do not want to see when they have already carried too much weight for too long. The forest hid an army because the men on one side needed it to be hidden and the men on the other side needed to believe the hiding place was empty. Yet even in the hidden German camps there were moments when the weight showed. A veteran sergeant who had survived years on the Eastern Front found himself helping a much younger soldier who had started to shake from the cold and the strain. The older man did not lecture. He simply shared his own blanket for an hour and told a quiet story about a village he had once defended when everything seemed lost. The story was not heroic. It was about ordinary men doing what had to be done because there was no one else to do it. By the time he finished, the younger soldier had stopped shaking. He never thanked the sergeant out loud, but the next night he was the one who volunteered to help move a heavy gun into position without being asked. These small exchanges kept the hidden army from breaking under its own secrecy. They were the invisible threads that held the deception together. On the American side, the same kind of quiet resilience appeared in different ways. An artillery observer who had been in the sector for weeks began to notice patterns in the forest that did not feel right. He mentioned it to his lieutenant one evening while they shared a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The lieutenant listened, but the sector had been quiet for so long that it was easier to assume the observer was simply tired. The young officer had his own letter from home in his pocket, one that talked about plans for when the war ended. He wanted to believe those plans were close. So the report was noted and set aside. The observer went back to his post and kept watching, but he stopped mentioning what he saw. Sometimes the cost of being the one who sees too clearly is that no one wants to hear it. The forest itself became part of the story. To the Americans it was a place of rest, tall trees that muffled sound and snow that made everything look clean. To the Germans it was a living shield that had to be protected at all costs. Men on both sides walked the same paths at different hours and never knew how close they passed. A German patrol moving in the deepest part of the night once came within a few hundred yards of an American listening post. Both groups stayed silent, both held their breath, and both moved on without ever realizing how near the other had been. In that moment the entire war could have tipped, but the forest kept it secret because the men inside it were willing to endure the cold and the fear and the loneliness of not being able to speak. What made the hidden build-up possible was not just careful planning or strict orders. It was the way ordinary men on one side chose, day after day, to carry the burden of secrecy even when their bodies ached and their minds wanted to give up. And on the other side it was the way ordinary men chose, day after day, to accept the quiet because accepting it felt safer than questioning it. Both choices were deeply human. Both carried consequences that would only become clear when the silence finally broke. The full, uncensored truth of how an army can disappear into a forest and what that disappearance actually costs the men who make it happen is something that rarely makes it into the official stories. Those raw, unfiltered realities of exhaustion, fear, and the small acts of endurance that never get photographed for the newspapers are often the parts that stay hidden longest. If you want to see the kind of images and footage that capture exactly that hidden side of war, the moments too stark or restricted for public view at the time, there is a special collection available now that brings those unseen realities forward. You can find it through the link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end the forest did not care which side walked through it. It only cared that the men who used it as a shield or as a place of rest understood, even if only in their private moments, that the quiet they lived inside was never quite as empty as it seemed. The American soldiers who wrote letters about going home soon and the German soldiers who touched photographs of their families in the dark were both carrying the same fragile hope that their choices would be enough. One side believed the war had already moved on. The other side believed the war could still be won if no one saw them coming. Both beliefs were about to be tested by the same trees, the same snow, and the same sudden end of the silence they had learned to live with. And when that silence finally lifted, the cost would be measured not in maps or plans, but in the lives of men who had only wanted a little more time to believe the worst was already behind them. The quiet that had lulled them into believing the worst was overshadowed in an instant, replaced by a roar that seemed to come from every direction at once. In the forward positions along the Ardennes front, American soldiers who had been writing letters, sharing coffee, or simply trying to stay warm in their foxholes suddenly found the world exploding around them. The first artillery shells arrived without warning, screaming in from the gray sky and bursting among the trees with a force that threw men to the ground and filled the air with splinters and dirt. One private, barely out of his teens, had been halfway through a sentence to his mother when the blast knocked the paper from his hands. He stared at the torn page for a second too long, his mind refusing to accept that the quiet sector everyone had talked about was gone. Then another shell landed closer, and instinct finally took over. He grabbed his rifle and scrambled toward the sound of his sergeant's voice calling for the squad to form up, though in the smoke and noise it was hard to tell where anyone actually was. Further back along the narrow roads that wound through the forest, columns of trucks and jeeps that had been moving supplies or rotating tired units found themselves caught in the open. Drivers slammed on brakes as the first impacts rocked the ground. Men jumped from cabs and dove into ditches, some still clutching the letters or photographs they had been looking at moments before. A young corporal who had spent the morning complaining about the cold now found himself helping pull a wounded driver from a burning vehicle, his own hands shaking so hard he could barely grip the man's jacket. The wounded driver kept asking about his buddy who had been in the back, but there was no time to answer. The fire was spreading, and the road was already starting to clog with other vehicles trying to turn around under fire that seemed to be walking closer with every passing minute. What made the shock so complete was not just the sudden violence. It was the way the attack seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. German tanks and infantry emerged from the same forests the Americans had patrolled for weeks without seeing anything unusual. The white camouflage on the enemy vehicles blended into the snow that had fallen overnight, turning the familiar trees into something alien and threatening. A sergeant who had been in the line for months found himself staring at a tank that had appeared less than 100 yards away, its gun already swinging toward his position. For a heartbeat he could not move. Then training and fear collided inside him, and he started shouting for his men to fall back while he fired his rifle at the vision in front of him, knowing even as he did it that the small weapon would do almost nothing against the armored monster bearing down. In those first hours the lines did not so much break as dissolve into fragments. Small groups of men found themselves cut off from their companies, sometimes even from their own squads. A lieutenant who had been checking positions earlier that morning now tried to gather whoever he could find along a frozen stream bed. Some of the soldiers he collected were veterans who had fought their way across France. Others were replacements who had arrived only days earlier and had never heard a shot fired in anger until that morning. The lieutenant looked at their faces and saw the same raw fear he felt in his own chest, but he also saw something else beginning to form behind the fear. It was the stubborn refusal to let the moment decide everything. He told them they would hold this small piece of ground until someone came to relieve them or until they could no longer hold it. The words were simple, but in the chaos they gave shape to the only choice left. Not everyone could make that choice in the same way. On one stretch of road, a column of vehicles had become hopelessly tangled when artillery began falling among them. Drivers tried to back up, only to crash into the trucks behind them. Men abandoned their loads and ran for the trees, some carrying wounded comrades on their shoulders, others simply running because the sound of the incoming shells made any other action feel impossible. A medic who had been riding in one of the jeeps stayed with a soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. He worked quickly, his hands moving by feel more than sight in the smoke, talking the whole time in a low, steady voice that seemed to belong to another world. The wounded man kept apologizing for being a burden, and the medic kept telling him to save his strength because they were both going to make it out. It was a lie told with complete conviction, the kind of lie that sometimes becomes true simply because someone refuses to let it be anything else. The cold made everything worse and strangely more bearable at the same time. The snow that had seemed peaceful the day before now turned every movement into a struggle. Men's boots slipped on icy patches while they tried to run or drag equipment. Breath froze on beards and collars. The same cold that numbed fingers also dulled some of the sharper edges of panic, forcing men to focus on the next small task because thinking too far ahead felt impossible. A machine gun crew that had managed to set up on a slight rise found their weapon freezing solid between bursts. One of them pulled off his glove and used his bare hand to clear the action, wincing as the metal burned his skin. They kept firing anyway, not because they believed they could stop what was coming, but because stopping felt like giving the fear permission to win. In the middle of the confusion, there were moments when ordinary men did extraordinary things without ever thinking of themselves as heroes. A private who had been driving a supply truck saw a group of infantrymen pinned down by fire from a German half-track that had worked its way onto the road. Without orders, he turned his truck around, drove straight toward the enemy vehicle, and used the bulk of his own truck as a shield so the pinned men could crawl to safety. When his truck was hit and began to burn, he jumped clear, helped pull one last wounded man free, and then kept moving with the others as if what he had done was simply the next thing that needed doing. Later, when someone asked him about it, he could not remember making a decision. He only remembered that the men on the ground had looked like they needed help and that leaving them had never felt like an option. The fear did not disappear. It changed shape. For some it became a cold, focused thing that let them keep moving even when every instinct screamed to run. For others it came in waves that threatened to drown them until a buddy's voice or a sudden task pulled them back to the surface. A young soldier who had never been in combat before found himself separated from his unit and wandering through the trees with two other men who were just as lost. They stumbled on a small group of wounded who had been left behind when their unit pulled back. The three of them stayed with the wounded through the rest of the day and into the night, sharing what little food and ammunition they had, taking turns standing watch even though none of them knew which direction the next threat would come from. In the darkness, one of the wounded men asked if they were going to die there. The youngest of the three answered without hesitation that they were going to make it because they had each other and because giving up was not something they had been raised to do. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything the young soldier was trying not to feel. What the sudden attack revealed was how fragile even the strongest lines can become when the unexpected arrives with overwhelming force. The men who had been told this was a quiet sector had prepared for patrols and occasional shelling. They had not prepared for an entire army appearing out of the snow and fog with the single purpose of breaking through before anyone could react. Some units dissolved completely in those first hours. Others held together long enough to slow the advance, not because they expected to win, but because every hour they bought was an hour someone else might use to bring order out of the chaos. The education in those moments was not written in manuals. It was written in the way a sergeant stayed behind to cover his squad's withdrawal even when he knew he would not make it out himself. It was written in the way a medic refused to leave a dying man even when the rest of the position was falling back. It was written in the way scattered soldiers kept finding each other in the woods and forming new small groups that refused to stop being soldiers simply because the old lines had disappeared. By the time darkness fell, the roads were choked with abandoned equipment and the forest was full of men trying to find their way to safety or to some new position where they could make a stand. The cold deepened. Men who had been running or fighting all day now found themselves shaking from exhaustion and shock as much as from the temperature. Some built small fires in sheltered spots, risking the light because the alternative was freezing. Others simply huddled together, sharing body heat and the few blankets that had survived the day. In one such group, a lieutenant who had lost most of his company sat with his back against a tree and listened to the distant sounds of fighting that still echoed through the woods. He thought about the men he had led that morning and the ones who were still out there somewhere in the dark. He thought about the letter he had started writing the night before and wondered if he would ever finish it. Then he stood up, checked his weapon, and told the men around him that they would move at first light and keep moving until they found someone who could tell them where to go next. No one argued. They simply nodded and tried to get what rest they could, because the only thing left to do was survive the night and see what the morning would demand of them. The opening hours of the attack had stripped away every illusion of safety. They had shown how quickly the familiar can become terrifying and how the human spirit responds when there is no time left for anything but the next decision. Some men had broken under the pressure. Others had found reserves of courage they did not know they possessed. Most had simply done what they could with what they had, and in doing so had begun to write the first chapters of a story that would be told for generations. The lines had shattered, but the men who had held pieces of them were already starting to understand that the real test was not whether they could stop what was coming. It was whether they could keep moving, keep helping each other, and keep believing that their small acts of resistance still mattered in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. Stories like that, of men who refused to let fear have the last word even when everything around them was breaking, are the ones that deserve to be remembered in full. The dedication it took to hold a position or help a wounded buddy or simply keep walking when every part of you wanted to stop is the same dedication it takes to bring these moments out of the shadows and into the light, where they can teach us something about who we are. If these accounts of ordinary courage under impossible pressure mean something to you, and you want to help keep bringing these human stories to life for others who need to hear them, you can support the work with a small tip through the link in the description. Even $1 makes a real difference in the time and care that goes into researching and telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the shattered lines and the frozen fear were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning of what these men would have to endure and what they would have to become. The ones who survived that first terrible day carried with them the memory of friends lost and positions abandoned, but they also carried the quiet knowledge that they had not broken completely. They had bent, they had scattered, they had run when running was the only thing left, but they had also turned around, helped each other, and kept going. That stubborn, unglamorous resilience was the seed from which something larger would grow. And somewhere beyond the trees and the snow and the chaos of that opening assault, other men were already beginning to hear the news and to understand that the quiet they had known was gone forever and that the only way forward was through the same kind of fear and the same kind of courage these first shattered units had already begun to show. In a dimly lit room inside the ancient citadel of Verdun, 3 men who carried the fate of an army and the lives of thousands on their shoulders sat around a table that had already seen too much history, and now it was being asked to witness one more turning point that no one in that room had wanted but all of them knew could no longer be avoided. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of voices that tried to sound calm even though every man there understood the ground was shifting beneath them. Eisenhower sat at the head of the table, his face drawn from months of carrying a war that refused to end on anyone's schedule. He had not slept properly in days, and the lines around his eyes had deepened into something that looked more like permanent weariness than simple fatigue. Across from him sat Bradley, steady as always, the man who had to translate every big decision into the daily reality of divisions that were already stretched thin and men who were already tired of bleeding for ground that sometimes seemed to slip away the moment it was taken. And at the side of the table, never quite still, was Patton, his eyes bright with a fire that the crisis had only sharpened rather than dimmed. The reports coming in from the Ardennes were worse than anyone had allowed themselves to fear. What had started as scattered alarms had become a flood of bad news that painted a picture of lines breaking, units scattered, roads clogged with men and machines trying to move in every direction at once. Eisenhower listened without interrupting while Bradley laid out the latest information in his measured way, the kind of delivery that made even terrible facts sound like something that could still be managed if everyone kept their heads. But the facts were stubborn. The enemy had achieved surprise on a scale that no one had believed possible after months of Allied momentum. The quiet sector that had seemed like a place to rest tired divisions had turned into the place where everything could still come undone. Patton did not wait for anyone to ask what he thought. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, and spoke with the same direct force he used when he was standing in front of his own troops. He said he could turn his Third Army, shift it north, and drive into the flank of the enemy thrust. He said he could do it fast enough to matter. The words landed in the room like a challenge that no one had quite expected but that no one could ignore. Eisenhower studied him for a long moment, the weight of supreme command visible in the way he held himself, the way he seemed to be measuring not just the military possibility but the human cost of asking one more thing from men who had already given so much. Bradley, who knew Patton better than most, watched with the quiet understanding of a man who had seen this kind of boldness before and knew both its power and its price. What made the moment feel different from every other conference these men had sat through was not the maps or the arrows that staff officers kept moving across the paper. It was the sense that every decision in this room would be paid for in the lives of soldiers who were at that very moment fighting for their own survival in the snow and the cold. Patton spoke of his army as if they were already moving, as if the only thing standing between them and the relief of the threatened positions was the time it would take to issue the orders. There was no hesitation in his voice, no hedging about the difficulties. He had spent months pushing his men forward through difficult country and difficult supply situations, and now he was offering to do something even harder. To stop one attack cold and then swing the entire weight of his command in a new direction while the enemy was still trying to exploit his first success. Eisenhower carried the loneliness of the final word. He had to balance the needs of the entire front, the demands from every army group, the political pressures that came from capitals far away, and the simple human reality that every hour of delay meant more men dying in places they had not expected to be fighting. He listened to Patton's plan, asked the hard questions about fuel and roads and the condition of the divisions that would have to execute the turn, and heard answers that were confident without being reckless. Bradley added his own measured assessment, the perspective of the man who would have to make the orders work on the ground. In that room, the three of them were not just commanders weighing options. They were men who had seen too many good soldiers lost to assume that any choice was clean or without cost. Patton's restlessness showed in the way he stood to pace when the discussion grew too slow for his liking, in the way his voice rose slightly when he described what his troops could achieve if they were given the chance to strike back instead of simply holding. He had built his army on the belief that momentum mattered more than almost anything else, that the side that kept attacking kept the enemy off balance and kept his own men believing they could still win. Now he was being asked to prove that belief under conditions that would test it to the limit. The turn he was proposing was not a small adjustment. It was a complete redirection of an entire field army in the middle of winter, across roads that were already strained and through weather that offered no favors. Yet he spoke of it as if the only real obstacle was the willingness to try. The human weight in the room was not carried only by the three men at the center. Staff officers moved in and out with fresh reports, their faces showing the strain of trying to turn chaos into something that could be acted upon. One young major who had been handling communications from the threatened sector paused for a moment near the door, his hand resting on the frame as if he needed the solid wood to steady himself. He had a brother in one of the divisions that had been hit hardest in the opening hours, and the latest messages had been fragmented and frightening. He said nothing about it. He simply handed the latest sheet of paper to Bradley and stepped back into the shadows, carrying his private fear the way so many men in that room were carrying their own. The war had taught them all that personal stakes could not be allowed to slow the work, but it had not taught them how to stop feeling them. Eisenhower finally gave the order that set everything in motion. He told Patton to make the turn, to bring his army north as quickly as possible, and to relieve the pressure on the positions that were in danger of being cut off. The words were spoken without drama, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. They meant that the Third Army, which had been driving east with its own momentum and its own objectives, would now have to stop, pivot, and fight in a direction it had not planned for. They meant that thousands of men who had been preparing for one kind of battle would now face another. And they meant that the burden of making that pivot work would fall on the shoulders of every commander and every soldier in Patton's command, starting with the man who had just promised it could be done. Patton did not celebrate the decision. He simply nodded once, already turning his mind to the orders that would have to be written and the staff work that would have to be completed before the first units could begin to move. As he left the room, he paused for a moment in the doorway and looked back at Eisenhower. For that brief instant, the two men who carried such different styles of command shared something that did not need words. It was the understanding that the decision they had just made would be judged not by how bold it sounded in a conference room, but by how many lives it saved or cost in the days to come. Then Patton was gone, already moving toward the next task, the restlessness that had defined him now channeled into the single purpose of turning an army in the middle of a crisis. Bradley stayed a little longer, going over the details of coordination between the armies, the quiet work of making sure that one man's bold promise could actually be supported by the logistics and the communications that would make it real. Eisenhower sat alone for a few minutes after the others had left, the smoke from his cigarette curling toward the ceiling while he stared at the maps that still covered the table. In that moment, the Supreme Commander was not the symbol of Allied power. He was simply a man who had to live with the knowledge that every order he gave would be paid for by someone else's son or husband or father. He thought about the soldiers who were already fighting in the snow, the ones who had been told their sector was quiet and who had now discovered how quickly that could change. He thought about the men in Patton's army who would soon be asked to do something that had never been done on this scale in this kind of weather. And he thought about the enemy, who had taken a desperate gamble and who would now have to be met with a response that was equally bold if the gamble was to be turned against them. The meeting at Verdun did not end the crisis. It only marked the moment when the response began to take shape. What happened in that room was not just a change of plans on a map. It was a human decision made by men who understood the cost because they had already seen too much of it. Patton's promise to turn his army was not an empty boast. It was the expression of a belief that had been tested in harder places than this, a belief that speed and audacity could still change the outcome even when everything seemed to be going against you. Eisenhower's willingness to accept that promise and give the order was not blind faith. It was the calculated risk of a commander who knew that sometimes the only way to regain the initiative was to trust the man who was willing to take the hardest job. In the hours that followed, the orders began to flow outward from that room like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Staff officers worked through the night, translating the decision into movement orders, supply priorities, and the thousand small details that turn a commander's intent into something soldiers can actually do. Patton drove back toward his own headquarters with the same restless energy that had carried him through every previous campaign, already thinking about which divisions could move first and how to keep the momentum from dying in the confusion of a sudden change of direction. The men who would have to execute that change did not yet know the full scope of what was being asked of them. They only knew that the orders were coming and that whatever was happening in the Ardennes was serious enough to pull them away from the advance they had been making. What the meeting at Verdun revealed was the way great decisions are actually made. Not in moments of perfect clarity with all the information neatly arranged, but in rooms filled with smoke and tired men who have to weigh incomplete reports against the certain knowledge that delay itself carries a price. Patton's boldness was real, but it was grounded in the months he had spent building an army that believed it could do difficult things. Eisenhower's caution was real, but it was balanced by the understanding that sometimes boldness is the only thing that can answer a crisis of this scale. Bradley's steadiness was real, and it was the bridge that made the other two men's strengths work together instead of pulling against each other. The soldiers who would feel the effects of that meeting were still out in the cold and the snow, still fighting to hold positions or to find their way back to some kind of order. They did not know that in a room far behind the lines 3 men had sat around a table and decided that the answer to the crisis was to ask even more of them. They only knew that the situation was bad and that someone, somewhere, was trying to do something about it. That was enough for most of them. It had to be. The war had long since taught them that they could not control the big decisions. They could only control how they responded when those decisions reached them. The deep human drama of moments like this, where the weight of command meets the reality of men fighting and dying, is something that stays with you long after the maps are folded and the orders are issued. If you want to explore these pivotal turning points with the kind of depth and honesty they deserve, including the personal pressures and the quiet courage behind the big decisions, there is a place where we go further into the stories that don't always make it into the official accounts. You can join us on Patreon for free podcasts that dig into these moments, raw and unblurred video sections that show the human side of command, and a community of people who care about history the way it actually happened. The link is in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the table at Verdun was not just a place where plans were changed. It was a place where 3 men who had already given everything the war had asked of them chose to ask one more thing, not because it was easy, but because the alternative was to let the crisis become something that could no longer be turned around. Patton left that room carrying the promise he had made. Eisenhower stayed behind carrying the burden of having accepted it. And the soldiers who would have to make that promise real were already moving, even if they did not yet know the full shape of what they were being asked to do. The fateful table had done its work. Now the real test would begin on the frozen roads and in the shattered positions where ordinary men would have to turn a commander's bold decision into something that could still save the day. While the commanders had made their decision in the smoke-filled room at Verdun, the real work of turning an entire army fell to men who would not sleep that night, men whose hands would move the maps and whose voices would send thousands of others into motion before the first light touched the frozen roads. In the headquarters that served as the nerve center for Patton's Third Army, the atmosphere shifted the moment the orders arrived from the meeting. What had been a steady rhythm of planning and reporting became something sharper, more urgent, as staff officers gathered around tables covered with maps that suddenly needed to point in an entirely new direction. The room was crowded with men who had already been working long hours, their uniforms rumpled, their faces lined with the fatigue that comes from too many nights spent trying to keep an army moving forward through difficult country. Now they were being asked to make that army change direction completely, and to do it while the enemy was still driving hard into positions that had been considered safe only days before. A colonel who had spent the evening reviewing supply reports found himself standing over a large map with a greased pencil in his hand, drawing new arrows that pointed north instead of east. He worked quickly but carefully, because every line he drew represented thousands of men who would have to move across roads that were already strained by winter weather and previous traffic. His mind kept returning to the soldiers who would actually have to execute those lines on the ground. He thought about the drivers who would be climbing into cold cabs in the middle of the night, the engineers who would be checking bridges that might not hold under the sudden weight of redirected traffic, And the unit commanders who would have to explain to their men why the advance they had been pushing for weeks was now being called off in favor of something harder and less certain. The colonel did not have time to dwell on those thoughts, but they stayed with him as he worked, a quiet reminder that the maps he was changing were not abstract puzzles. They were lives. Outside the headquarters, the night was cold and clear, the kind of winter darkness that made every sound carry farther than it should. Convoy leaders received their new instructions and began the slow, deliberate work of turning their columns around or redirecting them onto different routes. One sergeant who had been driving supply trucks for months stood beside his vehicle and listened as his lieutenant explained what was happening. The sergeant had spent the day loading ammunition and fuel that was meant to support the eastward push. Now he was being told that same load would have to go north instead, and that it would have to get there faster than anyone had planned. He nodded, asked a few practical questions about the condition of the roads ahead, and then climbed into his cab without complaint. As he started the engine, he thought about his crew and about the men waiting for the supplies they were carrying. He did not know the full scope of the crisis in the Ardennes, but he understood that whatever was happening up there was serious enough to pull his truck away from the direction it had been heading. That was enough to keep him moving. Further down the chain of command, division and regimental staff officers worked through the night to translate the big decision into orders their units could actually follow. A major who had been looking forward to a few hours of rest found himself instead bent over a table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. He was responsible for coordinating the movement of artillery and supporting units, and every adjustment he made seemed to create two new problems that had to be solved before the first vehicles could roll. He kept thinking about the gun crews who would have to break down their positions, load their equipment onto trucks that were already overloaded, and then move through the dark on roads that offered little margin for error. The major had seen enough of war to know that logistics often decided more battles than bravery alone, but he had never been asked to rearrange so much, so quickly, under conditions that were already punishing. Still, he worked steadily, pausing only to rub his eyes or to share a quiet word with the captain sitting across from him. They did not talk about the larger strategy. They talked about fuel points and bridge capacities and the need to keep the columns spaced so that a single breakdown would not stop everything behind it. The human cost of that night showed itself in small ways that never made it onto any official report. A driver who had been on the road for 18 hours pulled into a makeshift assembly area and was told he would be turning around again within the hour. He climbed out of his cab, stretched his aching back, and accepted a cup of coffee from a soldier who had been waiting with a thermos. They stood together in the cold for a few minutes, not saying much, just sharing the warmth of the drink and the brief comfort of another human presence. The driver thought about his family back home and about how many more nights like this one might still be ahead. He did not complain out loud. He simply finished the coffee, handed the cup back, and walked toward his truck with the same steady step he had used every other time the Army had asked him to keep going when rest would have been easier. Engineers worked alongside the moving columns, checking roads and reinforcing bridges that had not been built to carry the sudden weight of an entire army shifting direction. One lieutenant in charge of a small engineer detachment spent the night moving from one potential bottleneck to another, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he inspected culverts and tested the strength of temporary crossings. He had been up since before dawn the previous day, and the cold was seeping through his coat in a way that made his hands stiff and slow. Still, he kept moving, because he knew that if even one bridge failed under the weight of the columns, the entire pivot could stall at the worst possible moment. He thought about the men who would be driving across those bridges in the hours to come, men who were counting on the roads to hold so they could reach the places where they were needed most. That thought kept him working even when his body wanted to stop. At every level, the same pattern repeated itself. Men who were already tired found reserves they did not know they still possessed. They worked by the light of lanterns and vehicle headlights, their breath visible in the cold air, their voices low but steady as they passed information and instructions down the line. A regimental commander who received the movement order gathered his staff in a small room warmed only by a single stove. He told them what was required without softening the difficulty of it. Then he asked each man what he needed to make it happen. The questions were practical and direct. No one in that room pretended the task would be easy. They simply focused on what could be controlled in the hours they had left before the first units had to be on the road. The educational reality behind that night was simple but often overlooked. Bold decisions at the highest levels mean nothing if the thousands of small, unglamorous actions required to carry them out do not happen on time and in the right order. The pivot north was not accomplished by a single dramatic gesture. It was accomplished by staff officers redrawing maps in the middle of the night, by drivers who kept their trucks moving despite exhaustion and bad roads, by engineers who made sure the paths remained open, and by commanders at every level who translated intention into movement without letting the weight of the moment paralyze them. These were the hidden acts of resilience that turned a commander's promise into something real. They were the quiet heroism that rarely gets remembered in the larger stories of battles won or lost, but without which no battle can be fought at all. As the night wore on and the first columns began to move, a sense of grim determination settled over the men who had made it possible. They had not been asked to fight in the dramatic sense that day. They had been asked to do something harder in its own way, to change direction completely while the enemy was still pressing hard elsewhere, and to do it fast enough that the change would still matter. Some of them wrote quick notes home before they climbed back into their vehicles or returned to their maps, short messages that said little about what they were doing but carried the quiet hope that the effort would be worth it. Others simply kept working, knowing that sleep would have to wait until the army they served had completed the turn it had been ordered to make. The logistical miracle that unfolded that night was not the product of perfect conditions or unlimited resources. It was the product of men who refused to let exhaustion or confusion become an excuse for failure. They worked through the cold and the dark because they understood that the soldiers already fighting in the Ardennes were depending on them, even if those soldiers did not yet know it. The maps had turned north, and with them had turned the hopes of an entire command that the crisis could still be met with something more than defense. The men who made that turn possible would not receive medals or headlines for what they did in those hours. Their reward was quieter and more personal, the knowledge that they had done what was asked of them when it mattered most, and that the army they served was now moving in the direction that might still make a difference. The pivot that changed everything didn't happen because of one dramatic order in a room. It happened because of hundreds of quiet decisions made by tired men in the dark, the kind of hidden logistical miracles and unsung efforts that often get overlooked in the bigger stories of war. If you want to explore more of those shadow operations and the forgotten heroes who made the impossible possible, including the intelligence gaps and the behind-the-scenes work that shaped so many turning points, there is a free ebook called The Shadow War, 5 top-secret operations that shaped World War II that goes deep into exactly those kinds of stories, along with weekly deep dives that keep uncovering the human side of history most people never hear about. You can get it through the secure link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the night the maps turned north was not just about changing the direction of an army. It was about ordinary men choosing to carry an extraordinary burden without complaint, because they understood that the alternative was to let the crisis grow beyond anyone's ability to contain it. The drivers who turned their trucks, the staff officers who worked without rest, the engineers who kept the roads open, and the commanders who passed the word down the line were all part of the same quiet effort. They did not know yet whether their work would be enough. They only knew that it had to be done, and that the men who were already fighting for their lives in the snow deserved nothing less than their best attempt. That attempt was now moving forward on frozen roads in the dark, carrying with it the hope that boldness at the top could still be matched by determination at every level below. The real test of that hope was still to come, but the foundation for it had already been laid by men whose names would never appear in the official accounts of what happened next. The columns moved north through a world of white and steel, where every mile demanded more from men and machines than either had been asked to give before. The snow had turned the roads into narrow ribbons of ice and packed white that fought every wheel and track. Lead elements of the armored spearhead pushed forward in the gray light of early morning, tanks grinding through drifts that sometimes reached the height of a man's chest. Inside the turrets and hulls, crews sat pressed together for warmth, their breath fogging the vision slits and their gloved hands stiff on the controls. One tank commander, a man who had already fought across too many miles of France, kept his eyes on the white expanse ahead and tried not to think about how many more hours of this lay between them and the place they were needed. He had seen men break under less. He had also seen the same men find something inside themselves when there was no other choice, and he was counting on that same stubbornness now. Behind the lead tanks, infantry moved on foot or in half-tracks that bucked and slid on the frozen surface. A young private from a small town in the Midwest walked with his head down against the wind, one hand gripping the strap of his pack and the other steadying the man in front of him when the snow grew deeper. They had been moving since before first light, and already the cold had worked its way through every layer of clothing. The private thought about the letter he had started writing 2 nights earlier, the one that still sat folded in his pocket because there had been no time to finish it. He wondered what his family would think if they knew he was walking through this instead of resting in some barn or captured house. He did not allow himself to dwell on it for long. Thinking too much about home made the present feel heavier, and the present already asked enough. Mechanical trouble came early and often. A tank in the second wave threw a track on an icy slope, the heavy steel links snapping under the strain of fighting both the grade and the snow. The crew spilled out into the cold, their breath rising in quick clouds as they worked with numb fingers to repair the damage. The commander of the column halted the vehicles behind them rather than risk leaving the broken tank isolated. While the repair crew labored, infantrymen spread out along the edges of the road, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands, watching the tree lines for any sign of movement. One sergeant moved among them, checking weapons and exchanging quiet words. He stopped beside a private who looked particularly miserable and offered a piece of chocolate he had been saving. The private took it without speaking, the simple act of sharing warming something deeper than his stomach. Moments like that kept men from turning inward too far. They reminded each other that they were not alone in this white furnace. Further back in the column, a supply truck slid sideways into a ditch and became stuck fast. The driver climbed out cursing under his breath, then immediately began digging snow away from the wheels with his bare hands because the shovel was buried somewhere in the load. 2 infantrymen who had been riding in the back jumped down to help without being asked. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of hands on snow and the distant rumble of engines ahead. When the truck finally rocked free, the driver offered them a cigarette each. They accepted, and for a few minutes the 3 of them stood together smoking, the smoke mixing with their breath in the cold air. None of them talked about how far they still had to go or what might be waiting when they got there. They talked instead about the ridiculous way the truck had looked half buried, and the laughter that followed felt like a small victory against the weather and the weariness. The enemy did not appear in force that first day, but his presence was felt in small, sharp ways. A rearguard position in a cluster of farm buildings opened fire on the lead elements as they crested a rise. The tanks returned fire while the infantry deployed into the snow on either side of the road. The fight was brief but intense, the crack of rifles and the heavier sound of tank guns echoing across the white fields. When it ended, the column moved forward again, leaving a few men behind to tend the wounded and secure the position. One of the wounded infantrymen, hit in the leg by a stray round, was carried to the side of the road by 2 of his squad mates. They wrapped him in a blanket and told him help would be along soon. He tried to joke that at least he would not have to walk anymore. The men who stayed with him smiled at the weak attempt at humor, but their eyes showed the same fear that lived in every man moving north that day. The fear was not just of being hit. It was of being left behind in this cold, of becoming another name on a list that grew longer with every mile. As the day wore on, the columns began to stretch and contract like a living thing fighting against its own limits. Vehicles broke down and were pushed to the side or repaired on the spot. Men grew quieter as exhaustion settled deeper into their bones. A tank driver who had been at the controls since before dawn found himself fighting to keep his eyes open even as the cold tried to numb everything else. His commander, riding in the turret, noticed the slowing and called down with a sharp word that was more concern than anger. The driver shook his head, blinked hard, and pushed the throttle forward again. Later, when they halted for a brief rest, the commander climbed down and handed the driver a flask of coffee that had been kept warm somehow. He did not say much. He simply waited until the driver had drunk it, then clapped him on the shoulder once before climbing back into the turret. The gesture said more than words could have in that moment. It said they were in this together, and that neither of them was allowed to quit. The snow continued to fall in fits and starts, sometimes light enough that the men could see the trees on either side of the road, sometimes thick enough that the world narrowed to the few yards immediately ahead. In those whiteouts, the columns slowed to a crawl, each vehicle following the dim shape of the one in front. A young lieutenant walking with the infantry found himself suddenly alone when the man ahead of him disappeared into a swirl of snow. He stopped, called out once, and felt a moment of pure, cold fear when no answer came. Then a hand reached out of the whiteness and gripped his arm. It was the same private he had been following, who had turned back when he realized the lieutenant was no longer behind him. They stood together for a moment in the swirling snow, neither speaking, until the wind shifted and the column reappeared ahead of them. The private simply nodded and started walking again. The lieutenant followed, carrying with him the knowledge that in this kind of fight, survival often depended on the smallest acts of looking out for the man next to you. Educational truth lived in every hour of that march. Winter warfare does not care about plans or schedules. It cares only about whether men and machines can keep functioning when everything is working against them. The crews who repaired tracks in the open learned quickly that bare skin could freeze to metal in seconds. The drivers who nursed their engines through the cold discovered that fuel lines could freeze and that batteries could fail without warning. The infantry who slogged through drifts learned that wet boots could lead to frostbite faster than anyone wanted to admit. Yet they kept moving because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the men who needed them would be left to face whatever was coming along. That understanding ran through every column like a current beneath the snow. It did not remove the fear or the exhaustion, but it gave both of those things a purpose. By late afternoon, the lead elements had covered ground that would have been difficult even in good weather. They had fought through mechanical failures, small enemy actions, and the relentless cold. They had done it with the same mix of frustration and quiet determination that had carried them across France months earlier. Now that determination was being tested in a new way, not by enemy defenses in depth, but by the simple, brutal mathematics of distance and weather and human limits. The men in the columns did not know exactly how far they still had to go or what they would find when they arrived. They only knew that the orders had come and that turning back was not an option anyone was willing to consider. The everyday endurance and quiet heroism of men who kept moving through conditions that would stop most people is the kind of spirit that defines the best of what soldiers can be. If you want to honor that fighting spirit and see stories of similar courage and sacrifice brought to life on screen, there are ways to keep that memory close. You might look for authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a small piece of the history these men lived, or you might want to watch the movie Midway on Prime, which captures the same relentless drive and endurance in another theater of the same war. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As darkness began to settle over the columns, the pace did not slacken. Men who had been moving since before dawn now faced another night of cold and movement. Some units found brief shelter in barns or ruined buildings along the route. Others simply halted where they were, posting guards and trying to find what rest they could in the open. A tank crew that had been repairing their vehicle by the light of a shielded lantern finally got it running again just as full dark fell. They climbed back inside without celebration, already thinking about the next stretch of road. One of them pulled a small photograph from inside his jacket, looked at it for a moment in the dim light, then tucked it away again. The others pretended not to notice. They understood the need for that small, private connection to something beyond the snow and the steel. The columns of ice and steel kept moving because the men inside them had decided, individually and together, that they would not be the ones who let the effort fail. They were cold, they were tired, and they carried the knowledge that worse probably waited ahead. But they also carried the stubborn belief that if they kept putting one foot in front of the other, if they kept fixing what broke and helping the man beside them, they might still arrive in time to make a difference. That belief was not loud or dramatic. It showed itself in the way a driver kept his engine running through another breakdown, in the way an infantryman shared his last dry socks with a buddy whose feet were wet, in the way a commander walked the length of his halted column in the dark just to let his men see that he was still with them. These were the small, human acts that turned an impossible march into something that could still be done. And as long as those acts continued, the columns would keep moving north, carrying with them the hope that endurance could still answer crisis when everything else had been stripped away. Inside the tightening circle of snow and steel around Bastogne, men who had been ordered to hold the crossroads found themselves holding something far larger, the fragile hope that their stand could still turn the tide for an entire front. The town itself was no longer the quiet crossroads it had seemed only days earlier. Shells fell at irregular intervals, sometimes in clusters that shook the ground and sent men diving for whatever cover they could find, sometimes singly like reminders that the ring around them was still closing. Paratroopers and the infantry who had been caught inside with them dug deeper into foxholes that were already half filled with freezing slush. They shared what little they had without being asked. A private who had been saving the last of his rations passed half of it to a man from another company whose own supplies had run out during the first confused hours of the encirclement. They ate in silence, their eyes on the tree line where the enemy was known to be moving, and neither spoke of how long the food would last or what would happen when it was gone. In an aid station set up in the basement of a damaged building, a medic worked by the light of a single lantern that had to be shielded from any crack that might show from outside. Wounded men lay on whatever surfaces could be found, some quiet, some moaning when the pain broke through whatever reserves they had left. The medic moved from one to the next with steady hands, conserving bandages and morphine because he did not know when more would come. He had already used more than he wanted to on a young soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. When the soldier asked in a low voice whether he would still be able to walk when this was over, the medic looked him in the eye and answered without hesitation that he would. The lie was told with complete conviction because the truth would have served no one in that moment. Later, when the same soldier drifted into a restless sleep, the medic sat nearby for a few extra minutes, not because there was anything more he could do medically, but because no man should have to wake up alone in a place like this. The cold was a constant enemy that required no ammunition. It crept into every corner, numbed fingers that needed to stay ready on triggers, and turned breath into visible clouds that hung in the air inside even the best shelters. Men learned to sleep in shifts, one watching while the other tried to rest with his back against the wall of a foxhole or the side of a building. A sergeant who had fought in earlier campaigns moved among his men during one of the quieter stretches, checking weapons and quietly asking about their feet. He had seen frostbite take men out of the line faster than bullets in other winters, and he was determined it would not happen here if he could help it. When one private admitted his boots were wet through, the sergeant produced a spare pair of dry socks from his own pack without comment and told the man to change them now while he still could. The private did not thank him out loud. He simply nodded and did as he was told, understanding that the gesture was not charity but the practical business of keeping the squad alive one small decision at a time. Leadership inside the perimeter showed itself in ways that had little to do with dramatic speeches. A battalion commander walked the lines in the dark, stopping to speak with small groups of men who had been awake for too many hours. He did not promise relief was coming soon because he did not know if that was true. Instead, he reminded them why the crossroads mattered, why holding this place still mattered even when it felt like the rest of the world had forgotten them. The men listened because the commander had already proven he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. When he left one position to move to the next, the men who remained felt the weight of the responsibility settle back onto their own shoulders, but they also felt the strange comfort of knowing they were not carrying it alone. The moment that would later be remembered as the heart of the defense came when a German delegation approached under a flag of truce and delivered a formal demand for surrender. The message reached the acting commander of the surrounded force, a man who had already seen his division cut off and who now faced the choice of whether to continue a fight that looked increasingly hopeless on paper. He read the demand once, considered it for the brief time it deserved, and then gave his reply in a single word that needed no elaboration. Nuts. The word traveled through the perimeter in the way important news always travels in such places, passed from man to man in low voices that carried both disbelief and a fierce kind of pride. It was not a word calculated for history. It was the instinctive response of a soldier who had decided that the only acceptable answer to an enemy who thought the game was already over was to refuse to play by those rules. In the foxholes and aid stations and command posts, men who heard it straightened a little, checked their weapons again, and settled back into the grim business of holding on. Supplies dwindled in ways that forced hard choices. Ammunition had to be rationed so that every round counted. Food became a matter of careful division rather than regular meals. Medical supplies ran low enough that decisions about who received what became daily burdens for the doctors and medics who had to make them. Yet the will to resist did not break. It showed itself in the way men continued to improve their positions even when they were cold and hungry, in the way they shared the last of a cigarette or a can of food without being asked, in the way they kept watch through nights that seemed longer than any night had a right to be. A paratrooper who had been in the line since the early days of the encirclement wrote a short letter to his wife during one of the quieter intervals. He did not describe the shelling or the hunger or the cold that had worked its way into his bones. He wrote instead that he was proud of the men around him and that he believed they were doing something that mattered. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his jacket, not knowing when or if it would ever be sent, but needing to have written the words anyway. The psychological pressure of encirclement was as real as the physical one. Men who had been trained to attack found themselves in the unfamiliar and often more difficult position of having to wait for the enemy to come to them. Every sound in the night could be the beginning of an assault. Every lull in the shelling could be the pause before something worse. Yet they adapted because adaptation was the only choice left. They learned the patterns of the enemy's fire and used the lulls to strengthen positions or move wounded. They learned to read the faces of their friends and to offer the right word or the right silence depending on what each man needed in the moment. A chaplain who moved through the perimeter during one long night stopped beside a foxhole where two men sat in silence. He did not offer prayers unless they were asked for. Instead, he simply sat with them for a few minutes, sharing the cold and the darkness, and when he left, the men felt less alone than they had before. Educational truth lived in every hour of that stand. A force that is surrounded does not survive on supplies alone. It survives on the belief that what it is doing still matters and on the leadership that refuses to let that belief die. The crossroads at Bastogne mattered because roads mattered in a war that still moved on wheels and tracks. Holding it denied the enemy the ability to shift forces freely and bought time for other decisions to be made elsewhere. But the men inside did not think in those strategic terms most of the time. They thought about the man next to them in the foxhole, about the wounded who needed care, about the next shell that might land closer than the last one. They held because stopping was not an option they were willing to accept, and because the alternative to holding was to let the enemy have something that had already cost too much to give away. As the days inside the perimeter stretched on, the hope that help would arrive began to feel thinner, but it did not disappear. Men continued to scan the southern approaches when the shelling allowed, looking for any sign that the columns they had heard were coming might finally break through. The lookouts who watched those approaches did so with the same quiet determination that had carried them through the first confused hours of the encirclement. They were cold, they were hungry, and they carried the knowledge that the ring around them was still tightening. But they also carried the stubborn conviction that as long as they could still fight and still help each other, the stand was not over. The full, raw truth of what it was like inside that encircled town, the cold that bit deeper every day, the hope that thinned with every shell, the quiet courage that held it all together, is something that often stays hidden behind the official stories of sieges and stands. Those uncensored realities of exhaustion, dwindling resources, and the human cost of refusing to break are the parts of war that rarely make it into the photographs or the headlines at the time. If you want to see the kind of raw images and footage that capture exactly those hidden struggles, the moments too stark or restricted for public view back then, there is a special collection available now that brings those unseen realities forward through a digital product created for exactly this purpose. You can find it through the secure link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the eye of the storm was not a place of perfect calm. It was a place where ordinary men made an extraordinary decision every hour, to keep holding when holding seemed to make no sense, to keep caring for each other when caring cost more than they had left to give, and to keep believing that their small piece of ground still mattered in a war that had already taken too much from too many. The crossroads remained in their hands not because the enemy had stopped trying to take it, but because the men inside had decided that giving it up was no longer something they were willing to consider. That decision carried them through the coldest nights and the longest days, and it was still carrying them when the first distant sounds of relief began to reach the perimeter from the south. Whether those sounds would arrive in time was still unknown. What was known was that the stand had already become something larger than any single man inside it, and that as long as even a few of them were still willing to hold, the eye of the storm would not be allowed to close completely. The steel of Patton's lead columns met the snowdrifts head-on, and in the villages south of the besieged town, men fought tank against tank and man against man in a struggle where every yard gained came at a cost measured in lives and endurance. The first village appeared out of the swirling snow like a ghost. Low stone houses with steep roofs, narrow streets already half-blocked by drifts, and the sudden, shocking crack of an anti-tank gun firing from a concealed position among the buildings. The lead tank shuddered to a halt, its commander shouting orders into the intercom while the gunner swung the turret toward the flash. Inside the cramped hull, the crew moved with the practiced speed of men who had learned that hesitation in moments like this was fatal. The loader slammed around into the breach, the gunner called the range, and the tank rocked with the recoil as it fired back. Snow and debris flew into the air where the enemy gun had been. For a few seconds there was silence, broken only by the idling engine and the sound of men breathing hard inside the steel box that was both their protection and their prison. Then the infantry who had been moving alongside the tanks came under fire from windows and doorways. Riflemen dropped into the snow, returning fire while trying to find cover that barely existed in the open fields leading up to the village. A young private who had been with his company only a few weeks found himself lying in a shallow depression, his face pressed against the cold ground, while bullets snapped overhead. He had never been this close to the enemy before. In training they had talked about advancing under fire, but nothing had prepared him for the way the snow seemed to amplify every sound and how the cold made his fingers clumsy on the rifle. Beside him an older sergeant, a man who had already fought across France, reached over and adjusted the private's helmet strap without a word. The small gesture steadied something inside the younger man. He lifted his head, found a target in a second-story window, and fired. The sergeant nodded once and moved forward, and the private followed because there was no other choice that made sense. Tank versus tank fighting in the snow was brutal and intimate. Visibility was poor, ranges were short, and every engagement felt like a knife fight between machines that weighed tons. A Sherman that had been leading the column took a hit from a hidden German tank positioned at the edge of the village. The round struck the front slope and ricocheted upward, but the impact was enough to stun the crew and jam the turret traverse. Inside, the commander was shouting for the driver to reverse while the gunner tried desperately to bring their own gun to bear. Smoke began to fill the compartment from a small electrical fire started by the hit. The loader, his face streaked with grease and sweat despite the cold, kept feeding rounds even as the tank lurched backward through the snow. They managed to get off 2 shots before the German tank fired again. This time the round penetrated. The explosion inside was sudden and final for most of the crew. The survivors, burned and bleeding, dragged themselves from the hatches into the snow, where infantry who had been following immediately pulled them to cover. One of the wounded tankers, his hands raw from the fire, kept asking about his gunner until someone told him the man had not made it out. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and asked for his rifle. He was not done fighting yet. The riflemen who supported the tanks learned quickly that winter combat in built-up areas demanded a different kind of courage. There was no sweeping advance across open fields. Progress was measured in houses cleared one by one, streets fought for yard by yard. A squad leader moved his men from building to building, using the tanks for covering fire when they could and their own rifles and grenades when they could not. In one house they found a small family who had been sheltering in the cellar. The mother held a child close while the father stood in front of them with a look that mixed fear and defiance. The squad leader spoke softly, showed them his empty hands, and motioned for them to stay down. Then his men moved through the upper floor, clearing it room by room while the tanks outside traded fire with enemy positions further down the street. When the squad emerged, the father pressed a piece of bread into the squad leader's hand. It was hard and stale, but the gesture was not about the food. It was about 2 men on opposite sides of a war recognizing something human in each other for a brief moment before the fighting resumed. Mechanical failures in the cold added another layer of frustration and danger. A tank that threw a track in the middle of an open field became an immediate target. The crew worked frantically in the open, their breath fogging the air as they tried to repair the damage while enemy fire searched for them. Infantry moved out to screen the stricken vehicle, lying in the snow and returning fire whenever a German position revealed itself. One of the tankers, a mechanic by training, worked with bare hands because his gloves made the work impossible. His fingers turned white and then began to burn from the cold, but he kept at the task until the track was back in place. When they finally got the tank moving again, the crew climbed aboard without celebration. There was no time for that. The column had to keep going, and every minute spent stopped was another minute the men in the besieged town waited for help that had not yet arrived. The personal cost showed itself in quiet ways that never made it into official reports. After one sharp engagement around a crossroads village, a tank commander walked the line of his platoon, checking on each vehicle and crew. He stopped beside a tank that had taken a glancing hit and spoke with the commander inside. The 2 men had known each other since training. They talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the way men do when they are trying to push the reality of what just happened a little further away. When the platoon commander moved on, the tank commander who had stayed behind sat for a moment in the open hatch, looking at the snow-covered fields where one of his friends had died only an hour earlier. He did not cry. There was no time and no privacy for that. Instead, he pulled a small photograph from inside his jacket, looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it away and gave the order to move out. The photograph was of his wife and child. He carried it the way other men carried good luck charms, not because he believed it would protect him, but because it reminded him why he had to keep going even when every instinct told him to stop. Infantry and armor learned to work together in the snow in ways that training had only hinted at. Tanks could not clear houses alone. Riflemen could not advance across open ground without the covering fire of the tanks. In one village, a platoon of infantry found itself pinned down by machine gun fire from a fortified position. The supporting tank moved up carefully, using the buildings for what cover they could provide, and put a round through the window where the gun was firing. The explosion silenced the position, but it also brought return fire from a hidden anti-tank gun. The tank was hit and began to burn. The crew bailed out under fire, and the infantry who had been pinned down now became the rescuers, laying down covering fire while the tankers ran for safety. One of the infantrymen was hit while helping a burned tanker to cover. The others dragged both men to safety behind a stone wall. In the minutes that followed, while the fight continued around them, the wounded infantryman and the burned tanker lay side by side. They did not know each other's names. They simply shared the small space and the shared understanding that they had saved each other's lives in the space of a few chaotic minutes. The snow itself became an enemy that changed the nature of every fight. It muffled sound and hid movement. It made every step an effort and turned every piece of equipment into something that had to be constantly cleared or it would fail. A rifleman whose weapon jammed from the cold worked the action desperately while his squad advanced without him. When he finally got it working again, he ran to catch up, slipping and falling in the drifts, arriving in time to see his squad leader go down to a sniper's bullet from a rooftop. The rifleman returned fire, drove the sniper back, then knelt beside his leader and tried to stop the bleeding. The squad leader was conscious enough to tell him to keep moving, that the squad needed him. Now, the rifleman stayed until a medic arrived, then rejoined his men with red on his hands and a new hardness in his eyes. He had come to the war believing that courage was about not being afraid. He was learning that courage was about doing what had to be done even when fear was the only honest feeling left. As the columns clawed their way from one village to the next, the cumulative effect of the fighting began to show on every face. Men who had started the march with determination now moved with the grim knowledge that every yard forward was paid for in blood and exhaustion. Yet they did not stop. Tank crews who had lost friends that morning were back in their vehicles that afternoon. Riflemen who had seen their squad leader fall took over the job of leading without being asked. The dedication that kept them moving was not loud or dramatic. It showed itself in the way a driver kept his engine running through another mechanical failure, and the way a gunner stayed at his post even when his hands were numb, and the way men shared the last of their rations or helped a wounded buddy to the rear when every instinct told them to keep their heads down. These were the small, human acts that turned an impossible advance into something that could still be done. The dedication of those tank crews and riflemen who paid such a heavy price in the snowdrifts is the kind of story that deserves to be told fully, because it is the kind of dedication that keeps history honest. If these accounts of ordinary men doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions mean something to you, and you want to help keep bringing these human stories to light so others can understand what was truly asked and what was truly given, you can support the work with a small tip through the link in the description. Even $1 makes a real difference in the time and care that goes into researching and telling these stories the way they deserve to be told. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the steel that advanced through the snowdrifts was not just the armor of the tanks. It was the unbreakable wool of the men inside them and beside them, men who had every reason to stop and who chose instead to keep moving forward, one frozen yard at a time. The villages they fought through would be remembered by some for the battles that happened there and by others for the simple fact that the columns did not turn back. The men who survived those fights carried with them the memory of friends lost in the snow and the quiet knowledge that they had done what was asked of them when it mattered most. And the men who did not survive were carried forward in the hearts of those who remained, their sacrifice becoming part of the reason the columns kept going. The road to the besieged town was still long and still dangerous, but every yard gained in those brutal engagements was a yard that brought the relief force closer to the men who were waiting inside the tightening ring. The steel had met the snowdrifts and had not broken. That was enough to keep moving. The lead tanks of the relief column crested the last snow-covered rise south of Bastogne just as the afternoon light began to fade, and for the men inside the tightening perimeter the distant rumble of friendly guns suddenly sounded like the first real hope they had allowed themselves in days. Inside the besieged town, a paratrooper who had been holding a forward position since the encirclement began climbed out of his foxhole for the first time in hours. His boots crunched through the frozen crust as he moved to a better vantage point behind a shattered wall. He had grown used to scanning the northern and eastern approaches for German movement, but today his eyes kept drifting south. Rumors had been moving through the perimeter for days, whispers that columns were fighting their way north, that help was coming, but rumors in a place like this could be dangerous. They raised hopes that might still be crushed. Still, he looked. Every man who could still stand or crawl to a vantage point looked south that day, because the alternative was to accept that the ring around them would only grow tighter until there was nothing left to hold. In a makeshift aid station in the basement of what had once been a school, a medic finished wrapping the stump of a soldier's leg and sat back on his heels for a moment. The room smelled of blood, disinfectant that was running low, and the damp wool of too many men crowded into too small a space. The wounded man on the table was conscious enough to ask if the relief was real. The medic, who had stopped counting the days they had been cut off, answered that he had heard the same rumors and that if the columns were close enough to be heard, then maybe this was the day. He did not promise anything. He had learned weeks earlier that promises made inside an encirclement often became lies before the words finished leaving a man's mouth. But he let the wounded soldier see that he believed it too, because sometimes belief was the only medicine left that did not come in a bottle. On the southern side of that same invisible line, the lead elements of the relief force were fighting for every yard. A tank commander in the point vehicle had been in the turret since before dawn, his eyes raw from staring through vision slits at a world that was all white and sudden violence. They had been ambushed twice that morning by German tanks and infantry who seemed to appear out of the snow itself. Each time the column had stopped, fought, and then pushed forward again because stopping for too long meant the men in Bastogne would keep waiting. The commander's gunner called out a target at the edge of a small cluster of buildings. The tank rocked with the recoil, and through the smoke the commander saw the enemy vehicle brew up in a black column that rose straight into the gray sky. There was no time to feel anything about it. Another target appeared almost immediately, and the cycle started again. A rifle squad moving just behind the tanks had been reduced by half since they started the final push. Their sergeant, a man who had already lost too many friends on the long march north, kept them moving by refusing to let anyone stop for longer than it took to catch their breath or help a wounded man to the rear. In one brief lull he knelt beside a private who was shaking from more than the cold and told him that the town was just ahead, that they were almost there. The private nodded without speaking. He had seen his best friend killed by a sniper 2 hours earlier and had not yet found words for it. The sergeant did not push him. He simply helped the younger man to his feet and moved with him toward the next piece of ground they had to take. That was how they had made it this far, one man helping another when there was nothing left to do but keep going. The first visual contact came when a lookout inside the perimeter spotted the distinctive shape of American tanks moving through the smoke and snow south of the town. He did not shout at first. He simply stared, as if his eyes might be playing tricks after so many days of seeing only enemy movement. Then he called out, and the word spread through the foxholes and buildings faster than any shell could travel. Men who had been lying low rose up, some of them cheering, others simply standing in stunned silence because relief had been something they talked about in the abstract for so long that seeing it actually happen felt unreal. A company commander who had been holding a critical section of the perimeter climbed onto the roof of a damaged house and used his field glasses. What he saw made him lower the glasses slowly and press his gloved hand against his eyes for a moment before he turned to his radio operator and told him to pass the word that friendly forces were in sight and still, fighting their way in. The actual link-up happened in the middle of continuing fire. A lead tank from the relief column broke through the last German position south of the town and rolled into the perimeter with its gun still hot and its hull marked by multiple hits. The commander popped his hatch and stood up in the cold air, looking around at the exhausted, dirty men who had been holding this ground for days. One of the paratroopers who had been manning a position nearby walked forward without his rifle, his hands raised slightly as if he still could not quite believe what he was seeing. The tank commander climbed down and the two men met in the open, snow swirling around them while artillery from both sides continued to fall. They shook hands like men who had just been pulled from drowning, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then the paratrooper said simply that they had been waiting. The tanker nodded and said they had been trying to get there. That was all. It was enough. The emotion of that moment did not last long because the corridor they had opened was still narrow and the enemy was already trying to close it again. German artillery and mortars began walking fire across the newly linked positions almost immediately. A half-track carrying wounded from inside the perimeter was hit before it could move more than 100 yards toward safety. Men who had been cheering moments earlier were now diving for cover or running to help the wounded. The tank that had made the first contact stayed in position and began engaging targets to the east while infantry from both the relief column and the besieged force worked together to widen the narrow path that had been carved through the enemy lines. There was no time for celebration. The link-up had happened, but everyone who had lived through the previous days understood that holding what they had gained would cost as much as reaching it had. In the aid station, the medic who had been treating the wounded soldier earlier heard the change in the sound of the fighting and stepped outside for the first time in hours. He saw American tanks moving through the streets and infantrymen who were not part of the original perimeter force. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the cold air clear his head. Then a runner found him and told him there were new wounded coming in from the southern edge where the link-up had happened. The medic nodded, turned, and went back inside. The work had not ended. It had only changed shape. A tanker from the relief column whose vehicle had been disabled in the final push sat on the side of the road with a blanket around his shoulders while a medic checked him for injuries. He had lost 2 men from his crew in the last engagement and had not yet let himself feel it. When the medic asked if he was all right, the tanker looked toward the town and said that they had made it. The medic, who had been inside since the beginning of the encirclement, sat down beside him for a moment. They did not know each other, but they shared the same exhausted, stunned expression of men who had both given more than they thought they had left and were still somehow upright. The tanker pulled a crushed pack of cigarettes from his pocket and offered one. The medic took it even though he did not smoke, because refusing would have felt wrong in that moment. They sat together in the snow while the fighting continued around them, 2 strangers connected by the fact that one column had finally reached the other. The emotional peak of that day was not pure relief. It was relief mixed with the immediate understanding that the corridor was fragile and that many more men would die before it was secure. A company commander from the relief force moved among his men, checking positions and making sure the wounded were being evaluated south. He stopped beside a paratrooper who had been fighting since the first day of the encirclement and asked how long they had been holding. The paratrooper looked at him for a long moment and then said that it felt like forever and also like no time at all. The commander nodded. He had seen enough fighting to understand what that answer meant. Then he moved on, because there was still work to do and because the only way to honor what these men had already endured was to make sure the link they had finally achieved did not break. Educational truth lived in that moment of contact. The relief of Bastogne was not the work of any single unit or any single dramatic charge. It was the convergence of thousands of small decisions and sacrifices made by men who had never met each other, tank crews who had fought through mechanical failures and ambushes on the long march north, infantry who had clawed forward yard by yard in the snow, defenders who had held their positions with dwindling supplies and no certainty that help would arrive in time. When the corridor finally opened, it did so because all of those separate efforts had met at the same place at the same moment. The emotion of that meeting was real and powerful, but it was also immediately tempered by the knowledge that success in war is often only the beginning of the next, harder phase. The deep emotional release of that link-up moment, the sudden, overwhelming realization that the siege was broken and that men who had been cut off were no longer alone, carries with it the continuing struggle of what came next, the fight to widen and hold the corridor against everything the enemy could still throw at it. If you want to explore these pivotal human stories with the depth and honesty they deserve, including the raw, unfiltered experiences of the men who lived through both the siege and the relief, there is a place where we go further into exactly these kinds of turning points. You can join us on Patreon for free podcasts that dig into the personal side of these moments, raw and unblurred video sections, and a community of people who care about history the way it actually happened to the people who lived it. The link is in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the day the corridor opened was not an ending. It was a beginning that had been paid for in blood and endurance by men on both sides of the link-up. The paratrooper who had climbed out of his foxhole that afternoon and the tanker who had stood in his hatch with smoke still rising from his gun had both given more than they would ever be able to fully explain. They had met in the snow and the continuing fire not as strangers but as men who now shared a story that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The corridor was open. The siege was broken. But the fighting did not stop, because in war the moment of relief is often only the moment when the next, harder test begins. And the men who had just found each other in that snow-covered town understood that better than anyone. They had held. They had reached. And now, together, they would have to keep holding what they had finally achieved. The corridor that had finally been opened to Bastogne was no wider than a thread in places, and every hour it remained open depended on men who fought not for glory but simply to keep that thread from snapping. The road that ran south from the town was a narrow ribbon of ice and packed snow, flanked on both sides by woods and fields where German forces still held positions strong enough to bring fire down on anything that moved. Supply trucks crawled along it in long, vulnerable columns, the drivers hunched over wheels slick with condensation, eyes straining through windshields that never quite cleared. Behind them came ambulances carrying wounded who had been waiting inside the perimeter for days, and ahead of them moved the engineers and infantry whose job it was to make sure the road stayed open at all. There was no dramatic charge here, no sweeping advance. There was only the constant, grinding work of keeping a lifeline from being cut while the enemy did everything in his power to sever it. An engineer lieutenant stood on the edge of a small stream that the road crossed, watching his men work on a temporary bridge that had already been hit twice that morning. The structure was little more than timbers and planking laid across whatever supports they could sink into the frozen ground, but without it the trucks could not pass and the corridor would close. Shells landed close enough to shake the ground beneath their boots, and every few minutes the lieutenant would order everyone to take cover in the ditch while another round walked across the area. When the shelling paused, he would climb back out and check the work, calling out adjustments in a voice that stayed steady even though his hands shook from cold and fatigue. One of his sergeants, a man who had been with him since the early days of the campaign, handed him a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. The lieutenant took it without looking away from the bridge. He did not thank the sergeant out loud because there was no time and because both men understood that the thanks was already in the way they kept working together when stopping would have been easier. Further up the road, a convoy of trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies had been halted by a crater left from an earlier bombardment. The drivers sat in their cabs with engines idling, breath fogging the glass, while infantry moved forward to clear the obstacle and engineers brought up the materials to fill it. One driver, a man who had been behind the wheel since before dawn, climbed out to stretch his legs and found himself standing beside a rifleman who had been posted as security for the column. They shared a cigarette without speaking for a while, the smoke rising in thin trails that disappeared quickly in the cold air. The driver finally asked how long the road had been open. The rifleman looked at him for a moment and then said that it felt like it had been open forever and also like it could close again any minute. The driver nodded. He had seen enough on the long drive north to understand what that meant. When the crater was finally filled and the column started moving again, the rifleman stayed at his post until the last truck passed, then fell in behind it on foot because that was where he was needed now. Inside the perimeter, the flow of supplies coming in and wounded going out changed the atmosphere in small but important ways. A medic who had been working with almost nothing for days suddenly had fresh bandages and plasma. He moved through the aid station with a different kind of urgency, not the desperate conservation of before, but the focused efficiency of a man who finally had the tools to do his job properly. In one corner, a wounded paratrooper who had been waiting for evacuation watched the medic work and asked quietly if the road was really holding. The medic paused long enough to meet his eyes and say that as long as men were still willing to keep it open, it would hold. The answer was not a promise. It was simply the truth as far as either of them could see it, and that was enough. The pressure on the corridor never let up. German artillery and mortars searched for targets constantly, and infantry probes tested the flanks where the thread was thinnest. A platoon holding a section of woods east of the road found itself under attack just after midday. The men there had been in position since before first light, cold and hungry and running low on everything except determination. When the first German assault came, they held their fire until the enemy was close enough that every shot counted. A sergeant who had already been wounded in an earlier fight moved along the line, checking positions and making sure no one fired too soon. When the attack broke against their fire, he stayed where he was, watching the woods for the next one, while the men around him reloaded and tried to steady their breathing. One of the younger soldiers, barely out of his teens, sat with his back against a tree and stared at his hands, which would not stop shaking. The sergeant noticed but said nothing about it. Instead, he offered the boy a piece of chocolate he had been saving and told him to eat it now while he still could. The simple act of sharing something small in the middle of everything else was enough to steady the younger man's hands and give him something to focus on besides the fear. Engineers worked under fire in ways that rarely made headlines but decided whether the corridor lived or died. A bridging team that had been rushed forward to replace a section damaged by shelling found themselves exposed on the open road while they laid the new timbers. Every time a shell landed nearby, they would drop whatever they were holding and flatten themselves against the frozen ground, then climb back up and keep working as soon as the debris stopped falling. One of the men on the team had been a carpenter before the war. He moved with the same careful attention to detail he had once used on houses back home, checking each joint and each support even while the world exploded around him. When the bridge was finally in place and the first truck rolled across it without collapsing, he allowed himself a single nod of satisfaction before turning to the next task. There was no celebration. There was only the next problem that needed solving before the corridor could be considered even temporarily safe. The emotional weight of holding that thread showed itself in quiet moments between the fighting. A convoy commander who had been moving supplies back and forth for 2 days without rest sat in his jeep during a brief halt and pulled a letter from his pocket that he had started writing the night before. He had been trying to find the right words to tell his wife that he was still all right and that the work they were doing mattered, even if he could not explain exactly how. He wrote a few more lines by the light of a shielded flashlight, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it away again. He did not know when it would be sent or if it would reach her before the next crisis came, but writing it gave him something to hold onto that was not the road or the shells or the constant fear that the corridor would close before they were ready. When he started the engine again and the column moved forward, he carried that small private act with him like armor. Artillerymen positioned along the corridor fired in support of the infantry holding the flanks and in counter-battery fire against the German guns that never seemed to stop searching for targets. Their positions were often exposed, and they worked with the same grim efficiency as everyone else. A gun crew that had been in action since before the link-up found themselves running low on ammunition just as another German probe developed on the eastern side of the road. They kept firing until the last round was gone, then helped move the wounded from a nearby infantry position while they waited for resupply. One of the loaders, a man who had been with the battery since North Africa, sat on an ammunition crate during the lull and closed his eyes for the first time in hours. He did not sleep. He simply rested his head against the cold metal and let himself feel, for a moment, how tired he was. When the resupply trucks arrived, he was the first one up, already moving toward the crates before anyone had to tell him what to do. The fragility of the corridor was never far from anyone's mind. A single well-placed shell or a determined enemy attack at the wrong place could close it again, and everyone who used it or defended it understood that. Yet they kept the thread intact not through any single act of heroism but through thousands of small decisions made by ordinary men under extraordinary pressure. Engineers who kept building even when the ground shook beneath them. Drivers who kept their trucks moving even when every instinct told them to stop. Infantry who held positions on the flanks even when they were outnumbered and outgunned. Medics who treated the wounded flowing in both directions without ever having enough of what they needed. These were the unglamorous acts that turned a narrow, dangerous path into something that could still be called a lifeline. The hidden, unglamorous heroism of engineers and logisticians who kept the fragile corridor alive is the kind of story that rarely gets told in full, yet it shaped the outcome of the entire campaign as much as any dramatic charge or famous stand. If you want to explore more of these shadow operations and the forgotten efforts that decided so many battles behind the scenes, there is a free ebook called The Shadow War: 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II that goes deep into exactly those kinds of hidden stories, along with weekly deep dives that keep uncovering the human side of history most people never hear about. You can get it through the secure link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the thread that connected the relief force to the besieged town held not because it was strong, but because men refused to let it break. They worked through the cold and the fire and the exhaustion because they understood that the alternative was to let the sacrifice of everyone who had fought to open that corridor be wasted. The engineers who rebuilt what was destroyed, the drivers who kept moving no matter what blocked the road, the infantry who held the flanks, and the medics who kept the wounded alive long enough to reach safety were all part of the same quiet effort. They did not know how long they would have to keep holding or what the final cost would be. They only knew that as long as the thread remained intact, the men inside Bastogne were no longer completely alone and the larger battle still had a chance to turn in their favor. That knowledge was enough to keep them working when every part of them wanted to stop, and it was enough to turn a fragile path through the snow into something that could still carry hope forward, one truck, one bridge, and one determined man at a time. The skies that had pressed down for days like a gray lid finally lifted, and the men who had been fighting in the white silence suddenly heard the sound of engines high above them. In the foxholes and ruined buildings around Bastogne, soldiers who had grown used to scanning only the ground and the tree lines now tilted their faces upward. The clouds that had hidden everything were breaking apart, revealing patches of pale winter blue. At first the sound was distant, a low steady drone that could have been anything. Then the shapes appeared, fighter bombers sweeping in low over the corridor, their wings catching the new light. A paratrooper who had been holding the same position since the encirclement began lowered his rifle for a moment and simply watched. He had not realized how much the constant low ceiling had weighed on him until it was gone. The planes were not just machines in the sky. They were proof that someone beyond the immediate fight still knew they were there and was doing something about it. The first resupply drop came without warning. Parachutes blossomed against the brighter sky, swinging down with crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies that had been desperately short inside the perimeter. Men who had been conserving every round and every bite now moved quickly to secure the bundles before they could be lost or damaged. One private who had been sharing the last of his rations with 2 others for days found himself standing over a crate of food that had landed almost at his feet. He looked at it for a long moment, then called to the men nearby. They worked together to drag it to cover, their hands clumsy from cold but their movements lighter than they had been in days. Later, when they opened the crate and divided what was inside, the private saved a small portion and carried it to a wounded man in the aid station who had not eaten properly in too long. The wounded man tried to refuse at first, but the private simply set the food down and said there was more now. The small act of giving when there was finally something to give felt like a return to something human after days of only taking what was necessary to survive. On the southern side of the corridor, the relief columns felt the change in the air almost as strongly. A tank commander who had been fighting through villages and snowdrifts for days heard the planes before he saw them. He popped his hatch and stood up in the cold wind, watching as the fighter bombers rolled in on German positions that had been harassing the column from the flanks. The explosions were visible even from his position, black bursts of smoke and flame rising from woods where enemy guns had been hidden. His gunner, still inside the turret, called up through the intercom that it looked like the skies had finally decided whose side they were on. The commander did not answer right away. He stayed standing a moment longer, feeling the sun on his face for the first time in what felt like weeks, then dropped back into the turret and gave the order to keep moving. The planes could not win the fight for them, but they could make the next miles possible in ways that ground forces alone could not. The airmen flying those missions carried their own weight. A young pilot who had been grounded by the weather for days briefed with his squadron in a cold dispersal hut that morning. The maps showed the narrow corridor and the position still held by the enemy around it. The briefing officer did not need to emphasize how important it was that the ground troops get relief. Everyone in the room had heard the stories coming back from the front about men fighting without enough ammunition or food. When the pilot climbed into his cockpit and took off into the improving weather, he thought about the men on the ground more than he usually did. He had flown missions before, but this one felt different. These were not abstract targets. These were Americans who had been cut off and were still holding on. He found the German columns trying to move reinforcements toward the corridor and rolled in low, releasing his bombs and then strafing with his guns until the road was blocked and burning. As he pulled up and turned for home, he caught a glimpse of American vehicles moving forward on a parallel road. It was the closest he would come to seeing the direct result of his work, but it was enough. The emotional lift that came with the returning air power was not loud or sustained. It came in small moments that added up across the battlefield. Inside Bastogne, a company commander who had been making hard decisions about ammunition and positions for days stood on the edge of a field and watched a flight of planes hammer a German battery that had been shelling the town. Each explosion seemed to loosen something tight in his chest. He turned to his radio operator and told him to pass the word that the skies were working with them now. The message moved through the perimeter faster than any supply drop. Men who had been fighting with their heads down began to lift them again, not because the danger was gone, but because they were no longer facing it completely alone. The interplay between the planes above and the men below was never perfect. Sometimes the weather closed in again for hours at a time. Sometimes the targets were hard to identify in the snow and the smoke. Sometimes friendly fire happened because the lines were confused and close. But when the conditions allowed, the partnership changed the balance in ways that could be felt immediately on the ground. German supply columns that had been moving under cover of the low clouds now found themselves exposed and under attack. Reinforcements that had been heading toward the corridor were delayed or destroyed before they could arrive. The men inside Bastogne and along the narrow road south of it felt the pressure ease just enough to breathe again, even if only for a little while. A medic working near the corridor watched a flight of planes strike a German position that had been firing on a convoy of wounded being evacuated south. The explosions walked across the enemy guns, and when the smoke cleared, the firing had stopped. The medic turned back to the men he was treating and saw something in their faces that had not been there an hour earlier. It was not victory. It was the beginning of belief that they might still make it out of this. He finished bandaging a wounded driver and then accepted a piece of chocolate from one of the supply bundles that had been dropped earlier. He broke it in half and gave one piece to the wounded man, who managed a weak smile. The medic smiled back. These small exchanges had always happened, but today they felt like they carried a little more weight because the sky itself seemed to be reminding everyone that help could still come from unexpected directions. The airmen who flew those missions understood the stakes in their own way. A squadron leader who had been leading flights over the corridor for 2 days in a row landed after a particularly effective strike and sat in his cockpit for a moment before climbing out. His wingman asked if he was all right. The squadron leader nodded and said he had seen American troops moving forward on the ground during the attack. He did not say more than that, but the wingman understood. They were not just bombing targets. They were trying to reach men who had been waiting for them. Later that evening, when the pilots gathered in the dispersal hut again, the talk was quieter than usual. They had done what they could with the weather they had been given. Now it was up to the men on the ground to make the most of the breathing room the planes had helped create. Educational truth lived in that clearing sky. Modern war had made the partnership between air and ground forces essential in ways that earlier generations of soldiers could never have imagined. When the weather allowed that partnership to work, the effect could be decisive. When the weather refused, even the best plans on the ground could stall. The men who had been fighting in the snow for days did not need lectures on combined arms to understand what the returning planes meant. They felt it in the way the enemy fire seemed less constant, in the supplies that reached them, in the simple fact that someone else was now sharing the burden of the fight. The airmen felt it in the targets they could actually see and hit, and the knowledge that their bombs and bullets were landing where they could still make a difference for men they would never meet. The dramatic shift when the skies cleared did not end the battle. It changed the terms of it. German forces that had been pressing the corridor now found themselves under attack from above as well as from the front and flanks. The men inside Bastogne who had been holding on through sheer will now had something more tangible to hold on to. The relief columns that had been fighting through snow and resistance found the pressure on them eased just enough to keep pushing. None of it was clean or complete. The weather could close again. The enemy could still counterattack. The cost in lives on both sides remained high. But for the first time since the corridor had opened, the men fighting to keep it open and the men who had been waiting inside it could look up and see that they were not fighting alone. That same fighting spirit, the one that refused to let mud or cold or exhaustion have the final word when the skies finally cleared and air power returned to support the men on the ground, is the spirit we still honor today in the stories we tell and the things we keep close. If you want to bring a piece of that history into your own home, or experience another powerful story of courage and sacrifice from the war that shows how ground and air forces work together under pressure, there are ways to do it that feel right. You might look for authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a small piece of what those men carried, or you might want to watch the movie Midway on Prime, which captures the same relentless drive and partnership between different elements of the fight in another theater of the same great struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end the skies did not just clear. They remembered the men who had been fighting below them through the worst of the weather and the worst of the fighting. The planes that returned were not a miracle that ended the battle by themselves. They were a reminder that even in the middle of the hardest fights, help could still arrive from unexpected directions when conditions allowed. The men on the ground who had been holding the corridor and the men inside Bastogne who had been waiting for it understood that better than anyone. They had survived the gray days. Now they had the blue sky and the sound of engines above them, and that was enough to keep going when stopping had never really been an option. The thread they had been holding was still fragile, but it was no longer quite so alone. The dramatic push that opened the corridor to Bastogne had succeeded, but the real work of victory was only beginning, and it would be measured not in miles gained in a day but in yards clawed forward through frozen woods and ruined villages where the enemy still refused to yield. The columns that had fought so hard to reach the besieged town now found themselves facing a different kind of fight. The narrow path they had carved was secure enough for supplies to flow, but the ground on either side remained contested, and the German forces that had been driven back were still dangerous in retreat. What had felt like a race only days earlier now settled into something slower and heavier. Infantry moved through dense stands of pine where the snow lay deep between the trees, their boots sinking with every step, their breath rising in quick clouds that hung in the still air. Tanks followed where the ground allowed, their tracks chewing through the crust and throwing up sprays of white that settled on the men walking beside them. Progress came in small, hard-won increments. A squad would clear one patch of woods, only to find another line of resistance waiting in the next. A tank would support an advance across an open field, only to draw fire from a concealed position that had to be reduced before anyone could move forward again. A sergeant who had been with his platoon since the first days of the campaign walked at the head of his men through one such stretch of forest. The trees were close enough that the snow had not drifted as deeply in some places, but the undergrowth was thick and the visibility was poor. He kept his voice low when he gave orders, not because he feared being overheard but because shouting felt like a waste of energy that none of them had to spare. His men moved in a loose line, weapons ready, eyes scanning the shadows between the trunks. One of the younger soldiers, a replacement who had joined them only a week earlier, slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow and went down hard. The sergeant helped him up without comment, brushing the snow from the man's pack and checking that his rifle was still functional. The private muttered an apology, but the sergeant simply shook his head and kept moving. There was no room for embarrassment in this kind of fighting. There was only the next tree, the next rise, the next place where the enemy might be waiting. In the villages that dotted the landscape between the corridor and the shrinking German salient, the fighting took on a different character. Houses that had been damaged in earlier battles now became strongpoints. A platoon of infantry worked its way through one such cluster of buildings, clearing rooms one at a time while a supporting tank idled in the street outside, its gun trained on the upper windows. Inside the first house a small group of German soldiers had been holding out. The fight was brief and brutal, conducted at close range with grenades and rifles in spaces too tight for anything else. When it was over, the American squad leader moved through the rooms, checking for any remaining threat while his men caught their breath. In one corner he found a German soldier who had been wounded but was still conscious. The man looked up at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. The squad leader called for a medic instead of finishing the fight. Later, when the wounded prisoner was being carried out, one of the American riflemen offered him a drink from his canteen. The gesture was small and wordless, but it was the kind of thing that happened more often than the official accounts ever recorded. In the middle of the grind, men on both sides sometimes remembered that the person across from them was still a person. The tank crews that supported these advances faced their own frustrations. The snow and the broken ground made movement slow and mechanical failures frequent. A Sherman that had been leading a column through one village threw a track on a patch of ice hidden beneath a thin layer of snow. The crew dismounted quickly, working in the open while infantry provided what cover they could. The cold made their hands clumsy, and every few minutes they had to pause while another burst of fire searched for them from a nearby building. One of the crewmen, a mechanic who had been with the platoon since North Africa, worked with bare fingers because his gloves made the delicate adjustments impossible. His hands turned white and then began to burn, but he kept at the task until the track was back in place. When they finally got the tank moving again, he climbed back into his position without a word. The others in the crew understood. There was no time for complaint and no point in it. The column had to keep going, and every minute spent stopped was another minute the enemy had to prepare the next position. The emotional weight of this phase showed itself in the small spaces between the fighting. Men who had been carried forward by the urgency of the relief now found themselves grinding against an enemy that would not break cleanly. A company commander who had been pushing his men hard since the link-up sat with his platoon leaders during a brief halt in a ruined barn. They shared what little warmth the space offered and spoke in low voices about the ground they had taken that day and the ground that still lay ahead. One of the lieutenants mentioned a friend who had been killed earlier in the week during the final push to open the corridor. The commander listened without interrupting, then said simply that they would make sure the ground they were taking now counted for something. It was not a grand speech. It was the kind of conversation that happened when men had been fighting long enough to know that victory, when it came, would be paid for one hard yard at a time. The psychological toll of sustained pressure in difficult terrain was real and cumulative. A rifleman who had been moving through the woods for days found himself pausing more often than he had at the beginning of the campaign. He told himself it was only to check his equipment or to let the man behind him catch up, but he knew it was also because his body was protesting the constant cold and the constant movement. When his squad took another position after a sharp exchange of fire, he sat with his back against a tree and closed his eyes for a moment. The sergeant noticed but said nothing. Instead, he passed the man a piece of chocolate he had been saving from one of the supply drops that had come in after the skies cleared. The rifleman took it without speaking, ate it slowly, and then stood up again when the order came to move. The small kindness did not remove the exhaustion, but it gave him something to carry forward that was not only the memory of the men they had lost. Educational reality lived in every hour of that slow advance. Breakthroughs and dramatic reliefs created opportunities, but those opportunities had to be converted into lasting gains through sustained, often unglamorous effort. The German salient that had been driven into the Allied lines was not going to collapse on its own. It had to be reduced position by position, forest by forest, village by village. Infantry bore the brunt of that work because tanks could not go everywhere and because the enemy had learned to dig in and wait for the moment when the momentum of the initial push had spent itself. The men who did that work learned quickly that courage in this phase looked different from courage in the dramatic race. It was the courage to keep moving when every step was an effort, to keep clearing the next house when the last one had cost a friend, to keep supporting the man beside you when your own reserves were running low. That kind of courage did not make headlines, but it was what turned a narrow corridor into a shrinking pocket and what eventually forced the enemy to give ground he had fought hard to take. As the days passed, the cumulative effect of the grind began to show on every face and in every movement. Men who had started the relief with determination now carried an additional layer of weariness that no amount of rest could fully erase. Yet they continued because the alternative was to let the ground they had already paid for slip back into enemy hands. A tank platoon that had been supporting infantry through a series of small villages found itself in a position where the ground was too broken for the tanks to advance safely. The platoon leader dismounted and walked forward with the infantry commander to see what could be done. They stood together in the snow, studying the terrain and the enemy positions ahead, and after a few minutes the tank officer simply nodded and said they would find another way around or they would wait until the infantry had cleared a path. There was no argument. There was only the shared understanding that the job would get done one way or another because neither of them was willing to be the one who let it stall. The harsh, grinding reality of that slow advance after the dramatic race is something that often stays hidden behind the more famous moments of breakthrough and relief. The raw images and footage of men moving yard by yard through snow and ruin, of crews repairing tanks under fire, of small units holding positions long after the initial excitement had faded, capture a side of war that is rarely shown in full. If you want to see those uncensored realities, the exhaustion, the determination, and the quiet cost of turning a breakthrough into lasting victory, there is a special collection available now that brings exactly those hidden moments forward through a digital product created for this purpose. You can find it through the secure link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the slow grind of victory was not a lesser story than the race that had preceded it. It was the necessary continuation, the phase in which the price of every earlier gain was paid in full. The men who advanced through those frozen forests and ruined villages did not do so with the same urgency that had carried them north in the first place. They moved with a heavier step and a deeper understanding of what was still required. They lost friends in ways that felt both sudden and inevitable. They found small reserves of strength in each other when their own were gone. They kept clearing the next position and supporting the next advance because that was what the situation demanded and because they had decided, individually and together, that the ground they were taking would not be given back. The salient continued to shrink, not in dramatic leaps but in the patient, relentless pressure of men who refused to let the job remain unfinished. That refusal, repeated hour after hour and day after day, was what turned the relief of Bastogne into something larger. It was what ensured that the corridor remained open and that the enemy could not simply regroup and try again. And it was what carried the campaign forward when the excitement of the initial breakthrough had long since given way to the simple, stubborn business of finishing what had been started. The snow that had witnessed the fighting now lay over the fields and forests like a blanket trying to hide what had been done there, but the cost could not be buried so easily. In the days after the corridor had been opened and the pressure on Bastogne had eased, men moved through the same ground they had fought over only hours or days earlier. The silence was different now. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of men waiting for the next shell or the next probe. It was the heavier silence that settles when the immediate danger has passed and there is time to see what has been left behind. A rifleman who had been part of the final push walked slowly along the edge of a frozen stream where his squad had fought through a German position the afternoon before. The snow had already begun to cover the churned earth and the dark stains that marked where men had fallen. He stopped beside one such place and stood for a long moment, not because he wanted to linger but because something in him needed to acknowledge what had happened here. He did not know the names of the men who had died in this spot. Some had been his own. Some had been the enemy. In the snow they looked the same. Further back, near a cluster of ruined farm buildings that had changed hands twice in the last 24 hours, a medic moved among the wounded who had been gathered for evacuation. The most critical cases had already been taken south along the narrow corridor. What remained were the ones who could wait a little longer. The medic knelt beside a young soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. The man was conscious and trying not to show how much pain he was in. When the medic asked how he was doing, the soldier managed a weak smile and said he was fine, that others needed help more than he did. The medic had heard variations of that answer too many times to count. He finished what he could do with the limited supplies he still had, then sat back on his heels and looked at the line of men waiting their turn. Some were talking quietly among themselves. Others stared at nothing, their eyes fixed on something only they could see. The medic had been working without real rest since the first hours of the encirclement. He knew the names of most of these men and the stories of many. He also knew that some of them would not make it home, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a weight that never quite lifted. The psychological cost showed itself in small, private ways that men rarely spoke about out loud. A tank commander whose vehicle had been hit during one of the final pushes to widen the corridor sat on the fender of a recovery vehicle while mechanics worked on the damaged track. He had lost 2 men from his crew. One had been killed instantly. The other had been pulled from the burning tank but had not survived the night. The commander held a letter he had started writing to the family of the second man. He had written the same sentence 3 times and crossed it out each time because none of the words felt adequate. When one of the mechanics asked if he needed anything, the commander simply shook his head and folded the letter away. He would finish it later, when he could find the right way to say that a good man had done his duty and would not be coming home. For now, there was still work to be done and no time to let the weight settle too deeply. In the forests where the fighting had been heaviest, the snow covered everything with the same impartial whiteness. A patrol moving through one such stretch of woods found the bodies of both American and German soldiers lying where they had fallen. Some had been partially buried by the drifting snow. Others lay exposed, their faces turned toward the gray sky. The patrol leader, a sergeant who had already seen too much in too short a time, stopped his men and told them to help gather the dead. It was not their job in the strictest sense, but none of them argued. They worked in silence, moving carefully through the snow, lifting bodies that were already stiffening in the cold. One of the younger soldiers paused beside a German who could not have been much older than he was. The dead man's eyes were open, staring at nothing. The American private reached down and closed them gently, then turned away without speaking. Later, when the patrol had finished its grim task and was moving on, the same private asked the sergeant if they would ever know how many men had died in these woods. The sergeant looked at him for a moment and then said that they probably would not, and that maybe that was for the best. Some numbers were too large to carry. The quiet resilience that had carried men through the fighting now showed itself in different ways. A company that had been holding a section of the corridor since the link-up was given a brief rest in a village that had been cleared the day before. The men found shelter in damaged houses and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. One squad leader moved among his men, checking that they had dry socks and something warm to eat. He stopped beside a private who was sitting alone in a corner, staring at the floor. The squad leader sat down beside him without asking permission and offered a cigarette. They smoked in silence for a while. Then the private said that he kept seeing the faces of the men they had lost during the push north. The squad leader nodded. He said he saw them too. He did not offer any larger wisdom or any promise that the seeing would stop. He simply stayed there until the cigarette was finished, then stood up and told the private to try to get some rest because they would be moving again soon. The private nodded and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but the presence of another man who understood was enough to ease something that had been tight in his chest. Educational truth lived in these moments of aftermath. The true cost of any battle is never fully captured in the official tallies or the maps that show ground gained and lost. It lives in the men who walk away carrying memories they will never fully share, and the families who receive letters that try and fail to explain what happened, in the quiet spaces where survivors sit with the knowledge that they are still here and others are not. The snow that covered the fields and forests of the Ardennes did not distinguish between the dead of one side or the other. It simply fell, softening the outlines of what had been done and forcing those who remained to confront what could not be softened. The men who had fought through the relief and the widening of the corridor had accomplished something extraordinary. They had also paid a price that would stay with them long after the snow melted and the ground thawed. That price was not something that could be measured in miles or in days. It was measured in the small, private moments when a man paused beside a place where a friend had fallen and realized that the victory they were grinding toward would always carry the weight of what it had cost. A medic who had been working near the corridor for days sat on an ammunition crate during a rare lull and pulled a small notebook from his pocket. He had been keeping a list of the men he had treated, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he needed some way to keep track of the faces and the names. He turned the pages slowly, reading the entries he had made. Some of the names had lines drawn through them. Others did not. He closed the notebook without finishing and put it away. There would be time later to add the new names and to cross out the ones that needed crossing. For now, he simply sat and let himself feel the weight of what he had seen. When a young soldier came by and offered him a cup of coffee that had been heated over a small fire, the medic accepted it with a nod of thanks. They did not speak. There was nothing that needed to be said in that moment. The coffee was warm, and the silence between them was the kind that two men who have seen too much can sometimes share without needing words. The dedication required to honestly remember the true human cost behind every victory is not something that happens by accident. It requires time and care and a willingness to look at what is uncomfortable. If these stories of the men who paid that price mean something to you, and you want to help keep bringing them forward so that the cost is never forgotten or reduced to numbers on a page, you can support the work with a small tip through the link in the description. Even $1 makes a real difference in the research and the time it takes to tell these stories the way they deserve to be told. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the cost written in the snow was not only the cost of lives lost. It was also the cost carried by those who survived. It showed itself in the way men moved more slowly through the places where they had fought, and the way they spoke less about what they had seen and more about what still needed to be done. It showed itself in the letters that were written and never sent, and the cigarettes shared in silence, and the hands that reached out to close the eyes of the dead. The snow would eventually melt. The ground would thaw. New fighting would come, and new ground would be taken and lost. But the cost would remain, written not only in the landscape but in the men who had walked through it. They would carry it forward in ways both visible and invisible, and the story of what they had accomplished would always be incomplete without the story of what it had asked of them. That is the part of victory that is hardest to tell and most necessary to remember. And it is the part that the snow, for all its whiteness, could never fully cover. Even as his army clawed forward through the snow and the shattered villages, George Patton moved among his men with the same restless energy that had driven the entire campaign, his eyes taking in every detail while his mind weighed the cost of every mile gained. He had always believed that a commander's place was as far forward as he could get without getting in the way of the fighting itself. In the days after the corridor to Bastogne had been opened, Patton made a point of visiting the forward positions whenever the situation allowed. He arrived in a jeep that was as mud splattered and snow-crusted as any other vehicle on the road, his famous ivory-handled pistols visible at his hips. When he stepped out, men who had been exhausted moments earlier found themselves standing a little straighter. It was not fear that straightened their spines. It was the knowledge that the man who had demanded this impossible turn was now here to see for himself what it had cost. One afternoon he stopped at a makeshift aid station set up in the basement of a damaged house near the corridor. The room was crowded with wounded men on stretchers and blankets. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and damp wool. Patton moved slowly down the line, stopping beside each man long enough to ask his name and where he was from. He did not offer false cheer. When a young tanker with burns on his hands and face looked up at him, Patton simply said that he had heard what the crew had done to keep their tank moving when everything was against them. The tanker tried to speak, but his throat was too raw. Patton placed a hand on his shoulder for a moment, then moved on. Later, when the medic who had been working in that station was asked what the general had said, the medic answered that Patton had not said much at all. He had simply been there, and that had been enough. The men who served under him had learned to read his moods the way sailors read the sky. When Patton was angry, his voice carried and his language turned colorful in ways that could make a chaplain blush. When he was pleased, he could be almost gentle, though gentleness was not a quality most people associated with him. In the weeks of the Ardennes fighting, both sides of his nature were on display. He drove his commanders hard, demanding that they keep the pressure on even when their men were near the end of their strength. At the same time, he made a point of recognizing small acts of courage that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. One evening he stopped beside a group of engineers who had been working through the night to keep a bridge open under intermittent shelling. He asked their names and what unit they belonged to, then told them that without that bridge the corridor would have closed again. The men did not cheer. They simply nodded and went back to work. But later, when they spoke of it among themselves, there was a quiet pride in having been seen by the man who had ordered the whole impossible movement in the first place. Patton's own moments of doubt were rarely visible to those around him, but they existed. He carried the weight of knowing that every order he gave would be paid for in lives. After one particularly costly day of fighting to widen the corridor, he sat alone in his command vehicle for a longer time than usual before stepping out. His aide, a young captain who had learned when to speak and when to remain silent, waited nearby. When Patton finally emerged, his face was set in the familiar lines of determination, but there was something else in his eyes that the captain had not seen before. It was the look of a man who understood that victory, even when it came, would always be incomplete. Patton did not speak of it. He simply asked for the latest reports and began issuing the next set of orders. The doubt, if that is what it had been, was already being converted into action. He visited the hospitals when he could, moving through the wards with the same directness he brought to everything else. He stopped beside beds and asked men how they were feeling, not in the perfunctory way of a visiting dignitary, but as if the answer actually mattered to him. When a soldier who had lost a leg told him that he was sorry he would not be able to finish the fight, Patton answered that the man had already done more than most and that his war was over now. The soldier looked surprised. He had expected the famous Patton temper or a demand for more effort. Instead, he received something closer to respect. Later, when the soldier wrote home about the visit, he told his family that the general had looked him in the eye and spoken to him like a man, not like a broken piece of equipment. That letter, like so many others written in those weeks, carried more than news. It carried the sense that even in the middle of the hardest fighting, someone at the top still saw the individuals who were paying the price. The leadership philosophy that drove Patton was simple in its core and complicated in its execution. He believed that speed and audacity could overcome almost any obstacle, but he also understood that speed without preparation was suicide. He pushed his staff relentlessly to solve the logistical problems that made the turn north possible, and he pushed his combat commanders to keep moving even when every instinct told them to pause and consolidate. At the same time, he never lost sight of the fact that the army was made of men, not machines. He could be profane and demanding one moment and surprisingly tender the next. The men who served closest to him learned to accept both sides because they saw the results. When Patton visited a forward position, the soldiers there knew that he would notice if their equipment was not maintained or if their positions were not as strong as they could be. They also knew that he would notice the small acts of initiative that kept units functioning under pressure. That combination of high standards and genuine recognition created a loyalty that went deeper than simple obedience. One evening after a day of particularly heavy fighting, Patton stopped at a company command post that had been set up in a half-destroyed barn. The company commander, a young captain who had been in command for only a few weeks, was exhausted and trying not to show it. Patton asked for a report on the day's action, listened without interrupting, then asked a series of questions that showed he already knew more about the situation than the captain had expected. When the questions were finished, Patton looked at the captain for a long moment and then said that he had done well. The words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. The captain had been carrying the fear that he had not been good enough, that the losses his company had taken were somehow his fault. Hearing Patton say otherwise did not remove the losses, but it gave him something to carry forward that was not only guilt. Patton's spirituality was another part of the complex portrait that his men saw in fragments. He had always been a man of strong, if unconventional, faith. During the campaign he had asked the chaplain to write a prayer for good weather when the low clouds and snow had grounded the plains that his army needed. The prayer had been printed and distributed. Some men had carried it in their pockets. Others had read it and set it aside. Patton himself had carried a copy. He did not speak often about his faith in public, but those who knew him understood that it was real and that it shaped the way he viewed both victory and loss. In the quiet moments after visiting the wounded, he sometimes stood alone for a few minutes, his head slightly bowed, before turning back to the maps and the orders that never stopped coming. The men who fought under him did not always love him. Some resented the constant pressure. Some were frightened by his temper. But almost all of them respected the fact that he never asked them to do something he was not willing to see for himself. When he visited the front, he came as a commander who expected results, but he also came as a man who understood that results were paid for in blood and exhaustion. That understanding showed in the way he spoke to the wounded and in the way he recognized small acts of courage that might otherwise have been lost in the larger story of the campaign. It showed in the way he drove his staff to solve problems rather than simply demanding that they be solved. And it showed in the way he carried the weight of command without ever allowing it to become an excuse for inaction. The complex, deeply human portrait of leadership under impossible pressure is something that stays with you long after the maps are folded and the orders have been carried out. If you want to explore these nuanced stories of command and the men who bore its weight with the depth they deserve, including the private doubts and public demands that shaped so many turning points, there is a place where we go further into exactly these kinds of human moments. You can join us on Patreon for free podcasts that dig into the personal side of leadership, raw and unblurred video sections, and a community of people who care about history the way it actually happened to the people who lived it. The link is in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, Patton's unflinching gaze was not only turned outward toward the enemy and the ground still to be taken. It was also turned inward toward the cost his decisions carried and the men who paid it. He saw both the necessity of the turn north and the price it exacted. He saw the courage of his soldiers and the limits of human endurance. He saw the possibility of victory and the certainty that victory would always be incomplete. That ability to hold both realities at once, to demand everything while understanding what everything cost, was what made him the kind of commander who could turn an entire army in the middle of a crisis and still find time to stop beside a wounded man and speak to him as a fellow soldier. The campaign in the Ardennes revealed many things about courage and endurance. It also revealed something essential about the nature of leadership itself. The man who had ordered the impossible had done so not because he believed it would be easy, but because he believed it was necessary. And when it was done, he walked among the men who had made it possible with eyes that missed nothing and a heart that carried more than most people ever knew. What had begun as Hitler's last great gamble in the snow now lay in ruins across the Ardennes, and the men on both sides who had survived it could feel the war shifting beneath their feet in ways that would not be reversed. On the German side, the retreat was not an orderly withdrawal but a slow, grinding collapse of men and machines that had been pushed beyond their limits. A young soldier who had marched into the offensive with the belief that one final blow could still turn the tide now found himself walking westward through the same forests he had entered only weeks earlier. His boots were falling apart, his coat was torn, and the rifle he carried felt heavier with every mile. Around him, the remnants of his unit moved in small, ragged groups. Some men spoke in low voices about home and what they would do if they ever reached it. Others walked in silence, their eyes fixed on the snow ahead as if looking back might break whatever remained of their will. The soldier thought about the letters he had written before the attack, letters full of the certainty that this time would be different. He no longer carried those letters. He had burned them one night when the cold had grown too deep and the future had grown too uncertain. Now he carried only the knowledge that the gamble had failed and that whatever came next would be worse than what had come before. Further back along the same frozen roads, a veteran sergeant who had survived years of fighting on other fronts watched his men struggle with equipment that no longer worked and orders that no longer made sense. He had known from the beginning that the offensive was a desperate throw of the dice. He had seen the same kind of gamble before, in other winters and on other fronts, and he had learned that when the dice came up wrong, the price was always paid by the men at the bottom. He moved among his remaining soldiers, checking that they still had ammunition and that none of them had fallen too far behind. When one of the younger men asked in a quiet voice whether they would ever stop running, the sergeant answered that they would stop when they were told to stop and not before. The answer was not comforting, but it was honest, and honesty was one of the few things left that still held any value. Later that night, when the column halted in a ruined village, the sergeant sat alone for a few minutes and wrote a short note to his wife. He did not describe the retreat or the fear that had settled into his bones. He simply told her that he was still alive and that he hoped the letter would find her. He folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside his jacket, knowing that he might never have the chance to send it. The failure of the offensive had drained Germany of its last reserves in ways that could not be hidden from the men who had to live with the consequences. Fuel that had been hoarded for this final push was gone. Replacements that had been scraped together from training units and rear area commands had been thrown into the fighting and lost. Equipment that could not be replaced had been abandoned in the snow when it broke down or ran out of ammunition. A tank commander whose vehicle had been destroyed during the final attempts to close the corridor now walked with the infantry, carrying only his personal weapon and a small pack. He had watched his crew die when the tank was hit, and he had carried one of them out of the burning hull before the flames took everything else. Now he moved with the same grim determination that had kept him alive through years of war, but the determination was no longer tied to any larger belief in victory. It was simply the habit of survival, the refusal to stop moving even when stopping might have been easier. When he spoke to the men around him, he spoke of practical things, where the next meal might come from, how to avoid the American patrols that were growing bolder with each passing day. He did not speak of the larger war or of what the failure of the offensive meant for Germany. Those were thoughts he kept to himself, locked away in the same place where he kept the memory of his dead crew. On the American side, the realization that the German gamble had failed brought a different kind of weight. Soldiers who had been fighting desperately to hold the corridor and then to widen it now found themselves pushing forward into ground that the enemy was no longer contesting with the same ferocity. A rifleman who had been part of the relief force walked through a village that had been heavily defended only days earlier and found it empty except for the debris of a hasty retreat. He moved carefully from house to house, checking for mines and booby traps, but the only resistance he encountered was the lingering smell of cordite and the cold that had settled into every corner. When he reached the last house on the edge of the village, he found a German soldier sitting alone in the kitchen, his rifle on the table in front of him and his hands resting on his knees. The American raised his own rifle, but the German made no move to resist. He simply looked up and said in broken English that he was finished. The American lowered his weapon and motioned for the man to stand. Later, when the prisoner was being marched back with others who had surrendered, the rifleman walked beside him for a while and offered him a cigarette. The German took it with a nod of thanks. They did not speak again, but the small act of sharing something ordinary in the middle of everything else stayed with the American long after the prisoner had been taken away. The broader consequences of the failed offensive were felt in the way the entire front began to shift. American units that had been on the defensive now found themselves with the initiative, able to choose where and when to attack rather than simply reacting to German moves. A company commander who had spent weeks fighting to keep his positions intact now studied maps that showed opportunities instead of only threats. He gathered his platoon leaders and explained that they would be pushing forward, not because they had been ordered to take some distant objective, but because the enemy in front of them no longer had the strength to stop them. The men listened without cheering. They had learned that every advance still carried risks and that every mile gained still cost lives. But there was a change in the way they moved and in the way they spoke to each other. The grim determination that had carried them through the worst of the fighting was still there, but it was now mixed with something else, a cautious sense that the end of the war in Europe might finally be visible, even if it was still far away. Educational truth lived in the way the failure of one offensive changed the trajectory of an entire war. Germany had committed its last major reserves to the Ardennes gamble. When that gamble failed, there was nothing left to replace what had been lost. Manpower that could have been used to strengthen other fronts had been thrown away. Equipment that could not be manufactured fast enough had been destroyed or abandoned. The initiative, which had briefly seemed to swing back toward Germany, now passed permanently to the Allies. On the ground, this shift showed itself in the way American forces began to move with greater confidence and in the way German units began to disintegrate under pressure that would once have been manageable. The men on both sides did not need maps or strategic briefings to understand what was happening. They felt it in the way the fighting changed, in the way the retreats grew longer and the advances grew steadier, in the way the end of the war began to feel less like a distant hope and more like something that would eventually arrive, even if it arrived too late for many of them. A German soldier who had survived the entire offensive sat in a ruined barn one night and tried to write a letter to his family. He had been carrying a small notebook for weeks, adding a few lines whenever he could find a moment of quiet. The pages were filled with the ordinary details of a soldier's life, descriptions of the snow, complaints about the cold, questions about how things were at home. On this night he wrote something different. He wrote that he no longer believed the war could be won and that he was no longer certain he would see home again. He did not write those words to frighten his family. He wrote them because he needed to put the truth somewhere outside his own mind. When he finished, he folded the notebook and put it away. He did not know if the letter would ever be sent or if it would ever be read. He only knew that he had needed to write it. On the American side, a tanker whose crew had been part of the final fighting to secure the corridors sat beside his vehicle and read a letter from home that had finally caught up with him. His wife had written about the children and about the plan she was making for when he returned. She had not asked about the fighting or about when the war might end. She had simply written as if his return was a certainty. The tanker read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside his jacket. He did not tell his crew what it said. He simply climbed back into his tank when the order came to move and did his job with the same steady competence he had shown since the beginning of the campaign. Later, when the column halted for the night, he sat with his men and shared what little food they had. They talked about small things, the quality of the coffee, the condition of the roads, the rumor that the war might actually be winding down. None of them said it with certainty. They had all learned that certainty was dangerous. But the possibility hung in the air between them, and for the first time in a long while, it did not feel entirely foolish to consider it. The hidden strategic ripples that flowed from this single failed offensive reached far beyond the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes. They touched every front where German forces were still fighting and every plan the Allies were making for the final campaigns of the war. The men who had lived through the fighting did not see the full shape of those ripples at the time. They saw only the immediate consequences, the retreats that grew longer, the advances that grew steadier, the sense that something fundamental had changed and would not change back. But even in those immediate consequences, the larger truth was visible. Germany had spent its last reserves on a gamble that could not succeed, and the cost of that gamble had been paid in the lives of men who had believed, or at least hoped, that it might still turn the war in their favor. The Allies, having absorbed the blow and having turned it back, now held the initiative in a way they had not held it since the early days of the invasion. The end of the war in Europe was still months away and would still cost thousands more lives, but the path to that end had been cleared of one of the last major obstacles. The offensive that had been meant to save Germany had instead sealed its fate, and the men who had fought on both sides of it were left to live with the consequences of a gamble that had failed in every way that mattered. The hidden strategic ripples and forgotten consequences that flowed from this single audacious race are the kind of stories that often stay buried beneath the more famous moments of breakthrough and relief. If you want to explore more of these shadow operations and the deeper consequences that shaped the final chapters of the war, there is a free ebook called The Shadow War: 5 Top-Secret Operations That Shaped World War II that goes deep into exactly those kinds of hidden stories, along with weekly deep dives that keep uncovering the human side of history most people never hear about. You can get it through the secure link in the description. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end, the offensive that doomed itself was not only a story of failed strategy or exhausted resources. It was a story of men on both sides who had been asked to believe in something larger than themselves and who had discovered, in the snow and the cold and the grinding retreat or advance, that belief alone could not change the outcome of a war that had already asked too much. The German soldiers who walked westward carried with them the knowledge that the last great effort had failed and that whatever came next would be fought without the reserves or the hope that had once sustained them. The American soldiers who pushed eastward carried with them the knowledge that the initiative was now theirs and that the end of the war, while still distant, was no longer impossible to imagine. Between those two truths lay the human cost that neither side could escape: the dead left in the forests, the wounded carried south along the corridor, the survivors who would carry the memory of what they had seen and done for the rest of their lives. The snow would eventually melt. The forests would grow quiet again. But the ripples of that failed offensive would continue to spread, touching every decision and every life that still remained in the war's final months. and the men who had lived through it would carry those ripples forward, whether they spoke of them or not, because some consequences are too large to leave behind. The snow that had fallen across the Ardennes eventually melted, but the ground it covered and the men who fought upon it remembered what had happened there long after the white had given way to spring. In the quiet that followed the final reduction of the salient, soldiers on both sides walked the same fields and forests where they had struggled only weeks before. An American tanker who had driven his Sherman through the worst of the fighting stopped beside a patch of ground where his platoon had lost a vehicle to a hidden gun. The snow was gone now, and the churned earth had begun to show the first hints of grain. He knelt and placed his hand on the soil as if he could still feel the cold that had bitten through every layer of clothing during those long days and nights. Around him, the rest of his crew worked on the tank that had carried them through the final pushes. They spoke little. There was no need for words when the memory of what they had endured lived in the way they moved and in the way they looked at each other. One of them, a loader who had been with the crew since the early days of the campaign, pulled a small photograph from his pocket and looked at it for a long moment before tucking it away again. The photograph was of his family. He had carried it through every mile of the turn north and every yard of the fighting that followed. Now he carried it back toward whatever came next, knowing that the man who had returned was not exactly the same one who had started the journey. Further north, near the town that had been the center of so much desperate fighting, a paratrooper who had held his position through the encirclement stood on the edge of a field that had once been part of the narrow corridor. The ground was still marked by the tracks of vehicles and the scars of shellfire, but the immediate threat had passed. He thought about the men who had stood with him in the foxholes during the worst of the siege, about the way they had shared what little they had and kept each other going when every reason to stop had seemed reasonable. He thought about the moment the first American tanks had rolled into the perimeter and about the raw mixture of relief and grief that had followed. Some of his friends had not lived to see that moment. Others had been wounded so badly that their war was over even if their lives continued. He had written letters to their families in the days since, letters that tried to capture something of who those men had been and what they had done. The words had never felt adequate, but he had written them anyway because it was the only thing left he could do for them. The lessons that emerged from those weeks of snow and steel were not written in official reports or celebrated in parades. They lived in the quiet reflections of men who had been forced to confront the limits of human endurance and had discovered that those limits were farther away than they had once believed. Adaptability had been the quality that allowed an entire army to turn 90 degrees in the middle of winter and still arrive in time to make a difference. It had shown itself in the way staff officers worked through the night to redraw maps and redirect supplies, and the way drivers kept their trucks moving on roads that should have been impassable, and in the way infantry and armor learned to support each other in terrain that favored neither. Bold leadership had been the force that turned a desperate situation into an opportunity. It had shown itself in the decision to attempt the impossible turn and in the presence of commanders who refused to accept that the situation was beyond saving. That leadership had not been perfect. It had demanded more than many men thought they could give. But it had also recognized courage when it appeared in small, unglamorous forms and had refused to let the weight of command become an excuse for inaction. Unity under pressure had been the thread that held everything together when individual strength would not have been enough. It had shown itself in the link-up at the edge of despair, when men from different units and different commands met in the snow and immediately began working together to widen the narrow path they had created. It had shown itself in the way engineers rebuilt bridges under fire and in the way medics treated wounded from both sides when the fighting paused. It had shown itself in the quiet moments when one soldier helped another who was struggling to keep moving, when a tanker shared the last of his coffee with an infantryman whose own supplies had run out, when a sergeant stayed behind to cover his squad's withdrawal even though he knew he might not make it out himself. These were not the acts that made headlines. They were the acts that made survival possible when survival seemed unlikely. The profound debt owed to every soldier who endured those weeks was something that could never be fully repaid. It lived in the families who received letters that tried to explain what had happened and in the communities that welcomed men home changed by what they had seen. It lived in the cemeteries where the dead were buried and in the hospitals where the wounded learned to live with what they had lost. It lived in the simple fact that the corridor had remained open and the salient had been reduced, not because any single man or any single unit had been invincible, but because ordinary men had refused to let the thread snap even when every reason to let go had been present. The snow had covered their tracks and softened the outlines of their struggles, but it had not erased the truth of what they had done. That truth remained in the ground they had fought over and in the memories they carried forward. A young soldier who had arrived as a replacement during the final days of the fighting sat on the fender of a truck one evening and wrote a letter to his parents. He had seen enough in those few days to understand that war was not the adventure he had once imagined. He had seen men die and men survive and had learned that the difference between the two was often smaller and more arbitrary than he had expected. In his letter he tried to describe some of what he had experienced without frightening them too much. He wrote about the cold and about the way the men around him had kept going even when going seemed impossible. He wrote about the moment the skies had cleared and the planes had returned, and about how that single change had lifted something in everyone who saw it. He did not write about the friends he had already lost or about the fear that still lived in the back of his mind. Those were things he was still learning how to carry. When he finished the letter, he folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of his jacket. He did not know when it would be sent or if it would reach home before the next phase of the war began. He only knew that writing it helped him feel connected to something beyond the immediate struggle. The enduring legacy of what happened in those weeks was not a single lesson that could be written on a plaque or taught in a classroom. It was a collection of qualities that had been tested under the most difficult conditions and had proven stronger than anyone had a right to expect. Courage had shown itself not only in the dramatic moments of breakthrough and relief, but in the quiet persistence of men who kept moving when every part of them wanted to stop. Adaptability had shown itself in the way an entire army had responded to a crisis it had not anticipated and had turned that crisis into an opportunity. Leadership had shown itself in the decisions made under pressure and in the presence of commanders who refused to accept that the situation was beyond saving. Unity had shown itself in the way men from different backgrounds and different units had come together to accomplish something none of them could have accomplished alone. These qualities did not belong only to the battlefield. They belonged to anyone who had ever faced a challenge that seemed too large and had discovered that the only way forward was to keep putting one foot in front of the other while helping the person beside them do the same. The snow and steel of the Ardennes had revealed these qualities in ways that no peacetime exercise could have replicated. They had shown what men were capable of when everything that could go wrong did go wrong and when the only choice left was to keep trying. They had shown that victory, when it came, was never clean and never complete, but that it was still worth fighting for because the alternative was to let the worst possibilities become reality. They had shown that leadership mattered, not because any single leader was infallible, but because the right combination of boldness and care could turn the course of events even when the odds appeared overwhelming. And they had shown that the human cost of such struggles was always higher than anyone wanted to admit, but that the debt owed to those who paid it could be honored by remembering what they had done and why they had done it. That same fighting spirit, the one that refused to let exhaustion or fear or the weight of loss have the final word, is the spirit we still honor today in the stories we tell and the things we keep close. If you want to bring a piece of that history into your own home, or experience another powerful story of courage and sacrifice from the war that shows how ordinary men and women rose to meet impossible challenges, there are ways to do it that feel right. You might look for authentic World War II memorabilia that lets you hold a small piece of what those men carried, or you might want to watch the movie Midway on Prime, which captures the same relentless drive and partnership between different elements of the fight in another theater of the same great struggle. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Because in the end what the snow remembered was not only the battles that had been fought or the ground that had been gained and lost. It remembered the men who had stood in that snow and refused to let it define them. It remembered the tank crews who kept their vehicles moving when every mechanical failure and every enemy shell seemed designed to stop them. It remembered the infantry who advanced yard by yard through forests and villages where every step could be the last. It remembered the engineers who rebuilt what was destroyed and the medics who treated the wounded and the commanders who made decisions knowing that lives hung on every word. It remembered the moments of kindness that had no place in any official report but that kept men human when everything around them was trying to strip the humanity away. And it remembered the simple, stubborn truth that when ordinary people are asked to do extraordinary things, they sometimes find within themselves reserves they did not know they possessed. That truth did not end with the melting of the snow. It carried forward in the lives of everyone who had lived through those weeks and in the stories they told and in the way they faced whatever challenges came next. The Ardennes campaign had been one chapter in a much larger war, but it had contained within it lessons about courage, adaptability, leadership, and unity that would remain relevant long after the last shot was fired and the last man came home. Those lessons were not the property of any single nation or any single generation. They belonged to anyone who had ever been forced to confront the question of what they were willing to endure and what they were willing to do for the people beside them. And the snow, in its own quiet way, had preserved them for anyone willing to look.